In his time hiding in plain sight as the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic, Sidious would have to put on a facade of just being another one of the wealthy Coruscant aristocrats. To this end, he wore fashionable robes and jewelry from his homeworld of Naboo, and surrounded himself with luxury indicative of a family's noble status of House Palpatine. But there was one area of Palpatine's fake life which displayed the most truth to his real character. But only those that have the eye to see it will understand exactly what we're talking about. That was the strange collection of art that he kept both in his apartment suite and his Chancellor's office. To those just walking in to visit, they may simply believe that Supreme Chancellor Palpatine was a cultured man, one who appreciated history and artistic ventures from all cultures of the galaxy. But in reality, they were surrounded by a cultish den of Sith artifacts, one of the greatest hints that there was far more to Palpatine than met the eye. However, every piece he displayed was so rare and obscure that not even the Jedi knew that they were being insulted to their very face whenever they sat within the office, not even Yoda. In today's Holocron, we are going to be exploring the meaning of each and every piece of Palpatine's art collection that we could find both within his office and in his 500 Republica penthouse suite. But before we open today's Holocron, we have experienced a terrifying vision. Many who use the archives have not yet subscribed yet, so if you've been enjoying the Star Wars lore, reach out and crush that subscribe button. It is your destiny. From what we found in our studies, every Sith Lord has their niche, and usually whatever they find interest in, they build up a vast and a large collection that is easily worth millions, if not tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. They typically seem to collect vast libraries of books, Sith knowledge, tomes, holocrons, any repositories of knowledge that they can locate whatsoever. Some Sith appreciate lightsabers and armor, those that symbolize the power and conquest of the ancient empire. For Palpatine though, he collected just about anything. He had this special affinity for artwork however, but not just Sith artwork. Palpatine would collect art from pretty much any culture because everything had special meaning for him. It was very rare that Palpatine would go on any trip, whether that be business or pleasure, and not come home with some sort of souvenir, claiming things that should have been in museums. This is not too surprising considering his upbringing in an aristocratic family though, who without a doubt taught him how to appreciate the finer things in life. Palpatine's art collection was unique in that it served several purposes. On a manipulative standpoint, Palpatine displayed his many pieces that he got as gifts, or found interesting from other worlds. This showed him as a man who appreciated all cultures of the galaxy, which would cause many voters to love him and believe that he was tolerant and an accepting man who loved and embraced everybody. On another political note, it was a way of distancing himself from his Naboo culture, representing himself as being one of the more cosmopolitan mindsets. But although we'll get into the art from other places in the galaxy in a moment, we of course first want to talk about his Sith collection. Ironically, he kept the former tucked away in his apartment suite. All of the art of the galaxy was to remain there, but the art of the Sith, that was to be in the Chancellor's office. Palpatine was always going the safe route with his life as a Sith, never doing anything that ran the risk of tipping off the Jedi. However, it seemed that there was a part of him that got a thrill by surrounding the Jedi with Sith or dark side inspired artifacts within his office. Very few of them ever knew the origins of these art pieces, or they misinterpreted them entirely. This allowed Palpatine to insult them in secret. In a way, it was letting them know that they were surrounded by the dark side, and they were literally blind to it. If any Jedi did recognize these pieces though, it was likely kept quiet because they dismissed Palpatine as being an eccentric collector, or they didn't want to mention it and rock the boat. In many cases though, it was Sidious proving just how politicized the Jedi had become, showing that he could rub the dark side in their face, and it didn't matter as long as he held political power. But anyway, let's actually walk through his office and talk about the individual pieces. The first and the largest of these pieces that we want to discuss is the Great Hyperspace Warbah relief. This crescent-shaped stone depicted a glorious battle between the Jedi Knights and the Sith warlords commanding giant, terrible monsters. Of these Sith, one of them is riding a massive lizard, and a Sith witch is on the ground with her lightsaber poised to strike. On the right side of the relief, there is what appears to be a Sith warworm attacking Jedi, and populating the image are many smaller aliens, which were apparently also under the command of the Sith Empire. This was hung on the wall of the antechamber in Palpatine's office, displaying for all to see and walking in to meet him. The stone frieze was carved by the Massacre slaves of the Naga Sadow Empire sometime after the Great Hyperspace War in the year 5000 BBY. This particular piece seems to be very important to the rulers of the Sith. It was actually in Darth Vitiat's chambers in the year 3678 BBY. Apparently, Emperor Vitiate somehow recovered it and decided to display it within his own collection on the world of Droman Ka, since it had been passed down or taken from Naga Sadow though, who was considered the previous Sith Emperor. This makes this something of an inheritance piece for all Emperors of the Sith. The piece was apparently returned to Yavin 4 at some point that is unknown in the timeline, because right at the start of the Clone Wars, Palpatine sends Mas Amedda to retrieve it, along with some pariah beetles. This is one of the rare few Sith pieces that the Jedi never knew about, largely because very few Jedi ever went to Yavin 4 in the first place, but also because it was in pristine condition, despite being almost 5,000 years old. Not only this, but none of the Jedi Council recognized the piece when they were visiting the Chancellor's office. In fact, they believed the artwork was meant to be flattering to the Jedi, and that the Supreme Chancellor had put it up there to honor them. In reality, it was a statement of Sith superiority, that no matter how much the Jedi tried, they could never truly stamp them out, and that soon, Palpatine would be Emperor again. Dotting various points in the office, this is where the large Brosnium statues of the four sages of Duarte are held. These beings were philosophers, lawmakers who possessed great influence during the days of the Great Galactic Republic. When it was in its infancy, they hailed from the inner realm world of Duarte, and even though they were hailed as arcane wisdom and legal acumen, the four of them were actually controversial figures. Their views and decrees were regarded as coldly unsparing and harsh, particularly regarding alien species and those joining the Republic. The statue of Feya, one of the four, wore a pointed hood and is depicted as crossing his hands to pull his cloak together around himself. The statue of Yanjon was shown with one hand in his opposite sleeve and the other hand on top of his arm, pointing upwards, and as well wore some sort of flared hat. The statue of Brata is shown wearing a helmet and holding a sword pointed downwards with two hands. Brata was one of the four sages that openly encouraged the study of the dark side back in the early days of the Republic. And finally, the last of the four is Sistros, the only female member of the sages. Sistros was known to pander to the masses in order to selfishly gain power, and she was depicted with her hands together, wearing a simple monk-like robe with the cowl pulled over her face, much like how Darth Sidious chooses to dress. It was Sistros that was apparently Palpatine's favorite, as he carried a small version of the statue with him at all times. And Mas Amedda even had an even smaller statue of her perch on his speaker staff. Palpatine's second lightsaber was also kept hidden in a cavity within a large statue of Sistros that was positioned firmly in his office. It is unknown when exactly these statues were made, but we do know that they were fashioned by Sith during a time when the Sith ruled the galaxy. It's difficult to say exactly when this could be, but our best guess would be that it was during the time of Darth Nihilus, 3950 BBY. This is one of the only times that the Sith had achieved true domination over the galaxy, beating back and nearly destroying the Jedi Order. But due to how little information of the four sages actually exists, we can only guess as to why the Sith were so fascinated by them. But it was likely because of their ruthless policies, their shameless public adherence to the teachings of the dark side. Palpatine had a lot in common with them, particularly with being a dark side aligned politician, but it was likely his dream one day to be able to represent the ways of the Sith in the public eye as the ruler of the galaxy. The effigies of the four sages could be his way of remembering that dream, representing his true ideals. The next two pieces of his collection were two spirit urns that flanked either side of the entrance to his office. These were used to store the remains of dead Sith Lords and other powerful Sith items. Palpatine would continue this macabre tradition, secretly storing the ashes of Darth Plagueis in one of the spirit urns, the way that his master could, in a way, always remain with him, always watch his days of rulership, being around to witness the success that he failed to achieve, that was stolen from him by his apprentice, as was his right. Even when the Empire was born, Palpatine still reflected on the teachings of Plagueis, and wondered what his master may think of his accomplishments. The last piece to talk about in Palpatine's office was the Sith chalice, one that lay in the hallway of his office on a table. This was a metallic incense burner used by the ancient Sith Lords during both initiation ceremonies, as well as in their rare meditation rituals. One of these was the mysterious Force Fire ritual, which we unfortunately don't know very much about. In canon though, the chalice would have been recovered by Malachor, but in legends, it too was found on Yavin 4 with the Ba relief. Jedi and Sith used incense to enhance their meditative experiences, and burners were sometimes used throughout the galaxy for many different cultural reasons, oftentimes though, just to make a room smell better. This was one of the pieces that the Jedi would have completely overlooked when in the presence of Palpatine. However, the contents of the chalice was a mystery to everyone except for the Dark Lord. He had filled it with the rare Korribanian incense, obviously from the Sith world of Korriban. This was extremely rare, as all travel to the Sith homeworld was forbidden on the orders of the Jedi. We doubt that Sidious actually burned away any of the incense for his own purposes, other than perhaps to smell it for himself. It is likely to him a piece of ancient Sith history. Traveling outside of his office and into his home, we can now discuss the cultural pieces that Palpatine kept in his penthouse. During his extensive traveling prior to his tenure as Naboo's representative, Palpatine had gathered many foreign objects of fine art. He had also been gifted many pieces by adoring peers in the Senate. The Quarren senator, Tychus, gifted him 3 very large pearls from the deep seas of his homeworld, the world of Mon Cala, or Dak. These pearls were highly prized and were held in cup-like ends of polished, fossilized trumpet weed. Interestingly, the Quarren was only a member of the Republic Senate until the Clone Wars began, when he defected to the Separatists. There, he would become a member of that leader's council. I imagine Palpatine kept his gift displayed as a way of showing that he was puppeteering both sides of the war. The next piece of art was a grand wind drum given to him by Senator Baskel Yershrim, who came from the world of Malastare. It was large and decorated with flower motifs. The drum had been created in an era of great spiritual awakening at some point in their history, leading to the creation of the drum, which was about 1,000 years old by the time it was given to the Chancellor. And finally, we have the Triffian carving gifted to Palpatine by Elin Lee, which depicted an ancient member of her species. This was a piece confirmed to have once belonged to a museum, but gifted to the senator. While individually each of these gifts held little value to Sidious, it was his collection as a whole that gained worth in his eyes. He cared more for the pieces that he picked up for himself, rather than the ones that was gifted to him by lesser beings. He usually selected objects with great personal meaning or power in the Force. Interestingly though, Palpatine would sometimes enter into a meditative contemplation of form, and he would draw strength from the artifacts in his office and in his apartment. The piece that we want to talk about, and the decor, were the scarlet drapes that covered his entire office and his apartment, as well as the color. From the curtains to the carpet to the furniture, everything was some shade of red. One of the visitors even made a comment that it wasn't hard to discern what his favorite color was. Palpatine brushed this off as a remark, simply stating that it was a prominent color in his family's crest on Naboo. But in reality, red carried great significance to Palpatine as a person and as a Dark Lord. Without a doubt, it is a reference to the red lightsabers of the Sith. Palpatine would later go on to teach Vader that it represented the burning torches of the dark side that lie within every Dark Lord. But red is also a signifier of royalty and authority on many worlds. It was a galactic sign of domination, personal ambition. It is the color of blood associated with murder and death. To Palpatine, it represented his unchallenged will, death, power, revenge. Massa metaspecies, the Chagrain, would also wear red when fighting because of their culture. To them, red was the color of war. It commands attention, and it was usually juxtaposed by black and gray when used by the Sith throughout their history in decorating and creating clothing for themselves. Palpatine would of course carry on the tradition, just as he did with many of these other art pieces. But this was Palpatine's extensive and strange collection of art. Each piece was meant to represent a different side of Sidious's interest and his character. At the same time, it was announcing his dreams, secretly spitting in the Jedi Order's face. It was a part of Naboo culture to use clothing and decoration to make statements. And as much as Palpatine tried to distance himself from his people and his home planet's ways, it seems that he carried this one aspect over into his life as a Dark Lord. The Trade Federation is actually way worse than many realize, and we may actually be able to call it Palpatine's greatest weapon in his early years in his Sith career. Greetings again, Acolytes, and welcome back to the Archives. One of Darth Sidious's first big plans when it came to the consolidation of power was using the Trade Federation to cause massive problems on his home planet in order to gain a sympathy vote, a vote that would place him in the office of the Supreme Chancellor. But Sidious wouldn't have thought to use the Trade Federation to do such a cruel act if it wasn't innately in their nature. If a perfectly legitimate business suddenly decided to cause a planetary crisis, it would raise a lot of suspicions. But the Trade Federation was anything but legitimate. Greed was a given, but their corruption and power ran far deeper than anyone could control. Viceroy Newt Gunray was only one man. Arresting him meant little when the evil Trade Federation was an entire entity, one which was the catalyst for the creation of the Clone Wars. So join us as we open a holocron and talk about the evil of the Trade Federation, Palpatine's greatest weapon before the Death Star. First though, we wanted to talk about what exactly the Trade Federation is, and how they used to operate before they became so corrupt. They weren't always an evil business bent on galactic market domination. There was only a very few differences in their origins between Legends and canon, so we'll mention both continuities here. We begin in the Golden Age of the Republic, which would have been around 350 BBY. The requirement for such a federation to exist can be traced back to the Republic's efforts to encourage economic development in the outlying star systems. By creating free trade zones encompassing those entire systems, the government effectively helped increase the flow of travelers and merchandise there. Free trade zones were simply areas in the mid and the outer rim where trade could be conducted without any sort of government taxation. The idea was proposed to help end the stagnation and isolation of the outer rim territories, those that were isolated following the Ruusan reformation in 1000 BBY. Ever since the end of the new Sith Wars, a lot of shipments of supplies to the outer rim of the war ceased entirely. This created a difficult life for the citizens living deeper in space. As a result, piracy and crime ran rampant. At the time, the Outer Rim territories of the galaxy were a mostly lawless frontier, outside of the general jurisdiction of the Republic, of course. In EU, the Trade Federation was created as a Republic-chartered branch in order to mediate disputes between the galaxy's merchants and shipping companies. At the time, transportation megacorporations were stifling commerce, but shutting out competitors from the Outer Rim spaceports, refusing to share any navigational data with them. The Trade Federation helped curb such abuses of power, so that a fair trade market could flourish in the unknown territories. In canon, with the creation of the free trade zones, the new wealth attracted pirates and plunderers of all kinds who preyed on the vulnerable trade caravans beyond the protection of the Republic. Consequently, a number of major commercial shipping and manufacturing corporations united together to ensure their own protection, forming the Trade Federation. The initial organization was meant to combat pirates, mediate disputes between its internal factions, and even promote their own interests before the Republic Senate. It was a very powerful branch, and it was so for about 100 years. But after this century, the Trade Federation had become a single entity, consolidating all of its internal companies into one giant conglomerate, and they were now a shipping cartel superpower. At the time, it was controlled by a directorate, which was led by a commanding viceroy. At first, the Trade Federation was composed mostly of a myriad of species, including the Neimoidians. The Neimoidians, who were known for their business skills and cutthroat dealings. Their species had a mind for commerce and finance, and they weighed every decision and interaction as if it were a big-time deal. It wouldn't be long until the Neimoidians were the ones in control. In the beginning, the Trade Federation was a model business that used their power to benefit trade companies and residents in the Outer Rim. The commerce guilds increasingly worked together to negotiate more favorable rates and policies, and soon even began to build their own fleet of starships. But this is where we get into the Lucrehulk cargo freighters, that would later become known as the command ships. By 250 BBY, the Trade Federation had advanced beyond its original mission. They had now become one of the most powerful organizations in the galaxy, and were lobbying to advance trade interests in the Galactic Senate. This also worked to open up new regions of the galaxy to trade and commerce, with the Trade Explorer Corps blazing numerous new routes into the Outer Rim territories, and establishing networks of retail outlets, depots, way stations, landing fields, in thousands of isolated systems. This connected to the Republic to new planets, offering a new economy to help impoverished worlds. Soon though, the Trade Federation found itself having to defend its transports from piracy. The Republic was going to be no help, since they refused to organize a proper military, and the planetary security forces were either too corrupt or ineffectual to help. So the Trade Federation established its own trade defense force, comprised of, you guessed it, battle droids. They were able to accomplish creating their own private military force, complete with battleships and starfighters, by using a legal loophole and calling it security. This was the beginning of the end. The very beginning of the Clone Wars, with the Neimoidians' considerable resources, including a far-reaching access of hyperspace networks, as well as a solid reputation as galactic traders. The Federation became one of the wealthiest corporate organizations in the entire galaxy, and began controlling a large portion of interstellar shipping passing through the Outer Rim territories. With the rapid expansion in the Outer Rim, They stifled competition and enforced deals with their powerful trade defense force. It soon dominated hundreds of star systems, but this was only on the front lines. They too had gained new power, influence on Coruscant and the Senate. By this point, the Federation had maps of hyperspace routes, those that they still refused to share, enabling them to cement their hold over trade routes. Only the Jedi and the Office of the Supreme Chancellor were able to maintain maps of similar quality. As their power continued to grow though, the Trade Federation started dominating galactic trade and ruthlessly suppressing opposition. By 124 BBY, trade between the core and the rim was once again dying out. In an effort to jumpstart commerce, the Galactic Senate declared that the Outer Rim was a free trade zone, but this merely exempted the Trade Federation from local taxation. It moved aggressively into the new free trade zone, crafting arrangements with impoverished sectors, worlds that the Federation could now control. What this meant is they essentially handed over Senate votes. Other sectors were forced to give up their economic self-sufficiency, becoming perpetual customers of the Trade Federation. What resulted was a massive number of Republic's representatives in their back pocket to use for proposing and voting on legislation in the Senate. Legislation that only benefited the Federation only. They controlled enough Senate votes to hamper competitors, influence the courts, and to stall legislation. These terrible deals they forged with the Outer Rim territories also effectively gave them control over their world's own political structures, and even allowed them to legally blockade the planet if they felt so inclined. In 67 BBY, it even gained a seat in the Senate despite not being a planet. To make matters even worse, the Federation gained full voting privileges as a part of a deal secretly negotiated by Higo Damask, Darth Plagueis. Although in order to do this, they had to relinquish some of their monopoly on the free trade zones, something the Namordians were very disgruntled about. Galactic industrial conglomerates such as the Federation became responsible for an economic upswing for senators, lobbyists, and entrepreneurs on Coruscant who placed themselves in the service of such massive organizations and groups. In a sense, the Trade Federation was responsible for a majority of the corruption in the Senate that we hear so much about. By 33 BBY, the Republic Senate had grown very troubled by the monopoly that the corporation had on the Outer Rim, and they met on Iriadu in order to discuss a taxation of free trade routes. However, as organized by Sidious, a radical terrorist group arrived and tried to assassinate everyone present at the meeting. However, they failed to kill the Supreme Chancellor Valorum, but they did kill every member of the Directorate. This left a power vacuum to be filled by the slimy and ambitious Nute Gunray. Soon after this, almost every member of the 7-person Directorate had been inexplicitly murdered, leaving Viceroy Gunroy as the last and the most powerful leader of the Trade Federation. It wasn't long before Darth Sidious approached Gunroy to use the Federation for his own plans. He had engineered Nute's rise to power himself, knowing that he would be easy to manipulate. The Dark Lord of the Sith promised power and money in return for accepting his orders alone, and the greedy Gunray accepted. He convinced them to lobby in the Senate for less restrictions on them creating more weapons for their droid army, citing piracy. This also allowed them to create even more battle droids, along with ground assault crafts, heavy artillery, all done in absolute secret away from the Republic. The Federation was building an army. But there were still those that opposed. Valorum decided that he could do was only to stifle the progress of the Federation, passing a Senate law which enabled taxation of the free trade zones yet again. To protest this though, and to push through its own proposed legislation, the Federation blockaded Naboo with its fleet, and invaded the planet with its droid army. All of this was done under the instruction of Sidious, who wanted to push Queen Amidala into placing a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum, and then get himself elected as a sympathy vote. At the time, he and Gunroy wanted to force the Queen to sign a treaty that would effectively give Naboo over to the company as an entire asset. Palpatine of course cared not for what happened to his homeworld, as if Naboo were under the control of the Federation, then it would be under his control as well. He could influence everything that was going to happen on the world, but he really didn't care. But of course, even though it failed, the invasion of Naboo would cause a chain reaction of events that would lead to the Clone Wars. The fact that the blockade happened at all revealed the weak and corrupt nature of the Republic government, spurring on several Rim worlds' desire to secede. This gave rise to Dooku, who fell from the Jedi Order after Qui-Gon Jinn's death, on a mission that the Republic should have taken care of rather than a Jedi. Nute Gunray, although he was arrested, continued to pull the strings of the Federation from the shadows, all the while supplying the Separatist movement with money, supplies, and battle droids. All the while, Sidious was cackling from the Chancellor's chair. All in all, the Trade Federation began as a legitimate business operation, one that positively impacted the lives of billions in the Outer Rim. But by the end of it, they had become so greedy and corporate that they caused many more deaths and became the catalyst to the rise of the Dark Lord of the Sith. One of his greatest weapons, in fact. The Trade Federation, when we peek behind the scenes, really allowed the Sith to rise in this era in the galaxy. By gaining control of them, this was the very first step that the Sith would take to finally claiming the entirety of the galaxy. It's a brilliant political move that was only allowed because of the Jedi and the Republic, and how they had grown to believe that they were the ultimate force in the galaxy, the perfect breeding ground for the Sith Empire. What does Darth Sidious do with Force sensitives in his own empire? Greetings again, Acolytes, and welcome back to the Archives. The advent of Order 66 saw the Jedi completely wiped from the galaxy. What survivors remained were either hunted down by Lord Vader or the Inquisitors, or they were driven too deeply underground that they could make no impact on the galactic stage. Darth Sidious wanted himself and Vader to represent the ultimate forceful beings in the universe, but that didn't necessarily mean that he would just execute anyone who was Force sensitive. A lot of the time, we see Palpatine inducting Force sensitives into his empire for one position or another. In canon, he even went after a Jedi crystal containing the locations of Force sensitive children. For us though, this begs the question, just what is Palpatine's approach to using forceful beings in the Empire? Are they all just collectively thrown into the Inquisitors, or is there more to it? Well, join us today as we crack open the classified Imperial files in order to find out what the Emperor does with Force sensitives that he discovers in the ranks of his own beautiful empire. Darth Sidious by nature believes that those who can touch the Force are innately better than those that cannot. In his mind, it fits the survival of the fittest mold. For eons, beings have evolved into better versions of themselves to climb the galactic food chain. But now that all beings have reached a point of sentience and advancement with tools and technology, the realm of the Force is the final frontier of evolution to Palpatine. Force sensitivity is incredibly rare, which is why those that have it are so special. American author Michael Lind did some extensive research into the lore of Star Wars and loosely calculated that the percentage of Force sensitivity occurs in the galactic population in only about 0.0067%. That's roughly about 67 in every 1 million. Rounding a little bit, that would make the number roughly 1 in every 15,000 people that can touch the Force in any capacity. With numbers like that, forceful beings are not only rare, but incredibly valuable. Even the ones that cannot manifest the Force in the physical world through telekinesis are special. Those with any capacity to wield it usually have some measure of precognition and lightning-fast reflexes, making them excellent warriors, pilots, and gamblers. The reason we bring this up is because Sidious often cites that as the very reason that he believes forceful beings are inherently better than normal people. And it's all the better if all of those who are forceful learn to use the dark side as well. In the Book of the Sith, one of Palpatine's annotations writes this: "Those who can touch the dark side have sight where others are blind. They must always lead those who lack that ability." Contrary to popular belief, Sidious doesn't perceive them as a real threat to him whatsoever. He actually enjoys when he finds Force sensitives within his empire, and he gets excited when they show a substantial amount of potential. But let's be perfectly clear, most of the time he has no interest in replacing Vader, or even some of his less powerful agents such as Emperor's Hands or even the Inquisitors. Even a fraction of Vader's power, 99.9% of the population, falls utterly short to the absolute terror that the Dark Lord commands. This is important, as it tells us why Darth Sidious didn't spend a whole lot of time searching for a new apprentice. Even in his broken state, Vader's power still supersedes what most of the galaxy can offer at their prime. There was a way that Palpatine utilized Force sensitives that really had nothing to do with the Sith. The rule of two remains in effect between Vader and Sidious, even if it has technically been fulfilled. Maintaining the status quo of two Sith was a better deal. The two already spent so much time eyeing each other suspiciously, it would get way too complicated to add someone else that they had to look out for. However, this did not mean that Palpatine could not advance his own desires with the rule of one. This was a doctrinal plan that Darth Sidious had been concocting ever since he had the idea to create his own empire. He explained the essence of the Rule of One in his manifesto, which can be found in the Book of the Sith. There he writes this: "As Darth Bane instituted the Rule of Two, so I will begin the Rule of One. The Sith will now be sustained by one to hold the power, and others talented in the Force to execute my will as dark side agents. He explains in greater detail by saying this: "As the rule of one is enacted, I will be free to enlist a throng of darkside followers. These talented mimics will be trained to replicate a smatter of my abilities, yet will never be even a fraction of my authority." This was the ultimate goal, to create a society where those with the dark side ruled, answerable only to their immortal Emperor Sidious. But just as the Senate couldn't know about the Death Star until it was completed with their committee abolished, so too could the officers and the agents of the Empire not know about Palpatine's own power until it would be far too late for them. Until Force sensitives were the ones running things, Palpatine was always playing the long game. He often found any forceful beings he could get his hands on and then trained them in the ways of the dark side. Then he would appraise their aptitudes and sort them into his various organizations around the Empire. Usually they were placed in positions of reasonable authority at first, able to command around other non-Force sensitives in the Empire, but always answerable to Vader and, of course, the Emperor. There were, of course, exceptions also to them being answerable to Vader, but we'll get to this in a moment. The Force sensitives that Palpatine finds can come from anywhere. He doesn't appear to have a preference. However, we did notice that he's not scouring the streets and planet sides for all of them the way that the Jedi had. Rather, Sidious allows them to naturally rise through the ranks of the Empire, or some rare cases, captured Jedi. In adherence to the Sith philosophy, Sidious didn't want just anyone who could touch the Force. He wanted beings who had experienced life's greatest sufferings, beings who had things taken from them, who had already experienced pain and trauma. It wasn't enough for them to be Force sensitive. He wanted them to be broken, ripe for dark side harvest. The first of these were captured Padawans and members of the Jedi Service Corps. For those of you who may not remember, the Jedi Service Corps was a branch of the Jedi Order that was much more humble and occupied jobs in the galaxy by serving the needs of civilians and the wider citizens of the galaxy. The Agri Corps were used the living force to promote agricultural growth in impoverished worlds. The Medicorps were field medics or temple doctors. The Explore Corps charted unknown planets and made first contact with brand new species. The Edu Corps worked in the archives under Jocasta Nu, but that's the very brief explanation of it anyway. But they were often comprised of Jedi Knights and Masters that had a lower aptitude in the Force, or just never felt comfortable in the other areas of Jedi life. This was largely made up of Padawans that had never passed their trials. Many of these Service Corps members, particularly those in the Agri Corps and the Explore Corps, survived the initial waves of Order 66, mainly due to the fact that they are so incredibly spread out, meaning many of them were not killed outright, but rounded up and taken to Palpatine's secret fortress on the world of Biss. There, they would be placed in a dingy room with other Padawans and left to starve while soaking in the energies of the world, a terrible place tainted by the dark side. Vader and Palpatine made a personal visit to them. Vader would command them all to engage in combat, and those that survived got to live and serve the Emperor. The Padawans, desperate, broken, began slaughtering each other in a bloodbath. As Vader observed, he was impressed with only a few of them, 4 to be exact: Antinous Tremaine, Gweblib Luif, Lanu Pasik, and Halmir. He commanded them to stop, took the 4 Padawans, and he had the rest of the room executed. Later, Palpatine would write this in the Book of the Sith: "The captured Padawan survivors from the Jedi Service Corps are less gifted in the Force, but they will serve me nonetheless as darkside adepts. Until I have use for them, they shall remain on Biss, where their connection to the Force will intensify the planet's growing nexus of darkside potency." On Biss, Palpatine carried out all sorts of darkside experiments and rituals that involved drawing the life force out of the inhabitants. The planet looked like a tropical vacation paradise. Palpatine advertised it as the most beautiful place in the Empire, particularly to the people of Alderaan who had lost their home. But it was all a farce. While people were living it up on the world of Biss in luxury, they did not know that their very life energy was being drained and funneled into every growing dark side nexus that Palpatine could get his hands on. And so now, Sidious had decided to do this with some of his newest Inquisitors. This just goes to prove that even if you think someone has too little potential for Palpatine's notice, he will still use them in some sort of depraved way anyway. Once he is his Jedi or whatever Force sensitive he wants in his possession, he will undertake the process of transforming them into a dark side adept, as he calls them, and that process involves breaking their spirit, training them to embrace the dark side as their only support. He explains this process by writing in the Book of Anger. Although the Jedi Order has been obliterated, many Force sensitives have now survived. Those who still hold to the belief that there is virtue in peace, or in closing oneself off to sensation, will be made to conform. They must find value in the ways of the dark side. Unleashing their anger is fundamental for drawing them into my fold, as well as for them to gain an understanding of the dark. For it is in anger that Force users are strongest. Once tapped, this emotion can turn idealists into slaves. Even those with brightly burning passions, those who vow to resist with their dying breath, can be broken in 3 simple steps. First, they must be tempted. The strong-willed always have something they desire, or something they possess that they fear to lose. They will see their drive to protect this item as noble. By encouraging this delusion, a puppet is created. Second, the puppets must be tested. By creating an immediate danger or placing subjects in peril, they will be forced to make a decision. Crazed by fear and the mere thought of losing what they hold so dear, they will do anything that is asked of them, if only to preserve their most cherished desires. Third, they must be forced to submit. A moment will arise when they will take a step too far, in panic or in fear. They will hurt others or commit a crime in such a way that the outside world will never forgive them. After that moment, there is no return from the dark side. Some who have been ensnared will choose to end their lives. Most, however, will accept their role as new warriors of the dark side. One life is ended, and a better one has begun. This chilling explanation characterizes the mindset and process that Palpatine takes into crushing the will of Force sensitives. He did this with a young Jedi prisoner by the name of Ferrus Olin, a particular boy with a strong connection to the Force who desired to kill Vader more than anything. Sidious decided to take advantage of that desire, and promised him knowledge to accomplish that goal. To Ferrus, he went beyond simply turning him to the dark side. Sidious gave him real Sith training and even a Sith holocron. He placed him in the Inquisitorius for a brief time just to get him into combat, but he kept a skeptical eye on Olin during the entire process. Yet the Inquisitorius wasn't the only place for Force sensitives. Palpatine didn't want to make just one order of beings, but rather several, each order given a specific task based on their aptitude. One might even say that the Inquisitors were one of the weakest branches of Palpatine's network of Force-sensitive underlings. The 2 other main groups that Palpatine had were the Shadow Guards and the Emperor's Hands. The Shadow Guards were an elevation from the red-robed Royal Guards, and despite most of them being non-Force sensitive, they were trained to have the fighting capabilities and reaction speed of a full-blown Jedi Knight. But from the few among their already elite order, some showed an amount of power within the Force. They were then elevated to the Imperial Shadow Guard. True to their name, they retained the style of their robes and armor, but instead of all red, it was colored entirely black with a red visor. Instead of stun pikes and blasters, the Shadow Guard were equipped with red-bladed lightsaber pikes. These were lightsabers with spear-like extensions on the hilt in order to give them better reach. The Shadow Guards made very rare appearances in the Empire, as they were only sent out on extremely special and difficult missions, such as when Starkiller was roaming around causing issues, but that is the level of the situation it takes for them to be deployed. The other order was the Emperor's Hands. They were unique in that Palpatine gave them special attention. Just like the Shadow Guards were taken from the Royal Guards, the Emperor's Hands were brought up by the ranks of the Inquisitors. Though this was not always the case, the Hands were elite agents all of the time, and were picked by Palpatine personally for their power and stealth abilities. They were meant to be the unseen enforcers of the Emperor's will, those that carried out highly secretive and specialized missions for Palpatine himself that the rest of the Empire could not know about. They had a more delicate touch than Vader usually did, and not to mention, there were things that Sidious needed to have taken care of that he didn't want Vader knowing about. They all received some form of specialized training directly from Sidious, but the most unique thing about their order is that each one of the Emperor's Hands were completely ignorant of the others. It was revealed that all of the Hands thought that they were the only one, which made them insanely loyal to Palpatine because he made them feel special and valued. In truth, this was a manipulation tactic. However, he did have a favorite, Mara Jade. Mara Jade was a girl not from the Inquisitors, but strangely, Sidious had taken her from her parents as a small child to be trained. Neither the Shadow Guards nor the Emperor's Hands were subject to the authority of Lord Vader. It was only when Palpatine expressly told them that they were to take his orders did they ever do so. This further serves to raise this level of importance within the Empire. Now, of course, that's not to say that the Inquisitors were too weak for notice, as one Inquisitor by the name of Jarek rose to rival Vader's own strength, but he and the rest of them were still subject to the Dark Lord's authority. The Emperor's apprentice was not fond of any of the other Force sensitives in the Empire. At best, he saw them as weak, petty, and inept. At worst, he found them to be a hindrance or a threat, but he didn't despise any of them as much as he did the Emperor's hands, simply because of their sheer arrogance, the audacity in thinking that they were something special to the Emperor, which they felt the need to rub in Vader's face whenever they could. But Vader knew the truth, of course. He wasn't allowed to reveal it to them though, and to the hands, they were none the wiser. And among them, of course, there was none that Vader hated more than his master's favorite, Mara Jade. Because she was his favorite, she had a different level of knowledge about the Sith and the inner workings of the Empire. Mara Jade constantly tried to rival and undermine Vader in order to curry Sidious's favor, and if that wasn't bad enough, she was allowed to be present whenever Palpatine punished Vader, adding humiliation. It is very rare that Sidious ever does his own dirty work. Throughout his entire life, secrecy was not the only name of the game, but was paramount to the survival and the victory of the Sith. As a Dark Lord in the rule of two, it was up to Sidious to tie up all the loose ends that could end up exposing him as a Dark Lord. This even extended into the reign of the Empire, when Sidious thought it was prudent to keep his identity hidden from the galaxy. The thinking behind this is actually pretty brilliant. Sidious didn't want to see the public have a Force-based ruler simply replaced with another after the fall of the Jedi, and so he used assassins or apprentices to take care of what needed to be done, and those that needed to be removed. But there were a few times, albeit extremely rare, that Sidious went and took care of matters personally. One may think of his duel with Maul and Savage Opress as an example, but during the Galactic Civil War, the Emperor now would rarely participate in any battle or skirmish. He had instruments like Vader and the Inquisitors, but there is one battle where Palpatine made a personal appearance as the Dark Lord. In fact, it was the only time he openly exposed himself as a Sith Lord to his Imperial subjects, and then he proceeded to carry out a private massacre. This was the mission to Bothawi, the time that Darth Sidious let loose and slaughtered an entire city. During the Age of the Empire, Palpatine continued to keep his identity as a Sith a secret. He explains why in his manifesto, stating that it would look bad to the public if one Force-based regime was replaced by another, which to the untrained commoner looks identical to the first. Sidious spent a long time ensuring that the Jedi looked as bad as possible, and the average person didn't know what a Sith even was. So if he were to out himself as a Force wielder and a saber-wielding wizard after denouncing the entirety of the Jedi Order, it would look terrible. Instead, he reclused himself away and had Vader be the face of the Empire's wrath. He allowed everyone to make up their own theories on who or what Vader even was. The truth about his identity didn't really matter at all, because people were good at scaring themselves with their own imaginations. And so while Vader went out and did all of the dirty work that Palpatine needed done, the Emperor remained peacefully in seclusion. Here he would carry out his job as the overseer of the Empire. He would study the dark side, perform rituals, and establish sinister plans and projects that would be used in the future. With Vader, the Inquisitors, and especially with the Emperor's hands, there was genuinely no need for him to ever leave this seclusion. But as we know, Palpatine would eventually get bored in the latter years of his rule. We talked about this in a previous video where he mentioned how he became unsatisfied and felt ultimately unfulfilled by his grand empire. Sidious was indeed a schemer, but if one thing can be learned about reading the Darth Plagueis novel and looking at Palpatine within his youth, he was an animal at heart. He enjoyed the violence of battle, the primal feeling of tearing life from an enemy with his bare hands. This scent of fresh blood was more pleasing to him than the finest incense, the sound of terrified screams more soothing to Sidious than the most exquisite music. Sidious was not forgiving to those that failed him simply because it was an opportunity to amuse himself, torturing them in horrific ways he could only imagine. And when the Galactic Civil War broke out, Palpatine suddenly had a massive new enemy to play with. Palpatine became much more involved in galactic affairs now that the Death Star was being constructed, and the Senate was disintegrated. At first, the rebellion was a detestable thing to him. The gall of an insurgency was something he desired to crush as quickly and even as openly as possible. They had become a massive thorn, especially once the rebels started creeping into the very infrastructure of the Empire. But their brazen revolution only offered Palpatine with the excuse that he had been waiting for, to finally get out of his cramped offices and act as a true Sith Lord once more. And in the year 0 BBY, an event would occur that made Palpatine finally lift himself up from his throne and decided to do things the old ways. Moff Kallist had turned traitor. Utilizing the Bothan spynet, he had gained priority secret plans for the Death Star and had then slipped them to the Rebel Alliance. The Bothan Spynet was an extremely well-organized intelligence network that had developed hundreds of years prior by the Bothan species. It was all about collecting intelligence on political enemies and either using it themselves or selling it to the highest bidders. During the Dark Times, most of their intelligence gathering was obviously against the Empire. No other spy network in the entire galaxy could claim the level of expansion that the Bothan Spynet could. It consisted of thousands of spies, informants, and data collection droids that fed into a centralized command structure. Using trade, bribery, espionage, and observation, the Spynet obtained information from every corner of the galaxy. And of course, Moff Kallist would be a mole for them, acquiring Death Star codes and snaking them through the Spynet to the Rebellion. Darth Vader would track down this Moff through a number of worlds before making a stand against the Empire with his own Star Destroyer flagship. However, his ship was disabled, and the Moff was captured. He was then brought directly for an audience with Emperor Palpatine, who brutally tortured him until he gave up his treachery. The Moff revealed that he had given the plans to the Bothans. Sidious, of course, was furious, and he murdered him as soon as his usefulness was over. For those who know anything about the production of the very first Death Star, you knew that it was a very difficult development process. In fact, it was described as development hell. If we aren't to include all of the construction that took place during and prior to the Clone Wars, this was a project that was over 25 years in the making. It was mired down by Sidious having to wiggle around the Senate. He had to cut costs on everything to put as much money as possible into the weapon. This caused a lot of issues on several fronts for the Empire, including their navy. All of the construction of the various individual parts had to be done in total secrecy, and many shipyards' worlds were converted for just that purpose. And then they had to find and use secret hyperlanes that no one knew about in order to make sure the parts to the Death Star could not be tracked. The construction itself was hindered by repeated uprising by the Wookiee slaves, numerous structural issues, and constant shipment interference from the Rebel Alliance. And it wasn't just secret from the public, but many levels of the Empire as well. We did a video on just how terrible the construction process of the Death Star actually was. And so, after funneling all of this time, stress, and resources into a single project, Palpatine was absolutely livid that the plans had been stolen and taken by the Bothans. Standing up from his throne, Sidious told both Vader and Grand Moff Tarkin to step aside. This he would be handling personally. The Emperor did not take an army as a show of force. He did not take Star Destroyers or an orbital bombardment. Palpatine took only himself, 2 royal guards in his shuttle, and went to the world of Bothawi, the homeworld of the Bothans. Touching down on the world, Sidious exited to find a welcoming committee kneeling before him. The Bothans greeted him as nobility and asked what they owed the great honor of having the Emperor visit their little world. But Sidious only responded by saying, "Your disloyalty to the Empire." He then reached out his hands and sprayed a torrent of force lightning, instantly executing every single one of them. The Bothans that were present were horrified, never having seen such power, or even having known that the Emperor was capable of it. He had only been an old man to them prior. And then, Palpatine takes out an old friend who had not seen the light of day in nearly a decade, his lightsaber. As soon as the Crimson Blade ignited, his personal guards went to work. Palpatine and the guards would storm the city as a 3-man army. They slaughtered every Bothan in sight without discretion and without mercy. The local security attempted to fight back against them, but they were only met with the full power of the dark side realized. Palpatine would even be so cruel as to dominate the minds of many Bothans, corrupting them in the Force and compelling them to massacre their own kin along with him. For the first time in decades, Palpatine let his inner monster loose on a bloodlusted rampage. Never before had Sidious actually been on the front lines of a ground battle before, but there he was, issuing orders, taking out the Bothans' assets, and wielding his lightsaber and the dark side indiscriminately. For this moment, Palpatine actually got to feel what it was like to be a Sith of old. In his personal writings, he had always praised and respected Malgus for his battlefield prowess, and now Palpatine himself got to live that. As a rule of 2 Sith, he may have never gotten this opportunity. In the end, he made sure to have his guards kill even the Bothans that he corrupted. And finally the planet surrendered, and even admitted that they had been the ones to beam the information to the Rebel Alliance on Tantive 4. Again, this is Legends continuity, so the story is very different from Rogue One, but Palpatine would then dispatch Vader to intercept the Corvette and recover the plans. But from that day forth, the Bothans knew exactly who Palpatine was. Just to himself, Sidious had always wished he could show his true power to those around him, Secrecy had always served him well, but he always wanted to make others kneel in fear. For years, he desired to show the Jedi Council what he was truly capable of. Every time he sat in a room together with them, he had to hold himself back from letting them know the real power of the Force, of the dark side. And as Emperor, he had to be wise in whom he revealed his true nature to. Things were complicated with the Senate after all. But by the time of 0 BBY, the Senate had been siphoned so much of its power that it was nothing but a useless husk. Palpatine's regional governors were the ones who actually called the shots, and he only allowed the Imperial Senate to believe they made a difference while they squabbled about and passed bills, those that never actually made any change whatsoever. And so because of the Senate's power and it being purely theoretical in the months leading up to the abolishment, it was far too late for them to do anything about their new emperor. In the same manifesto that Sidious stated he would remain hidden even as emperor, he also stated that it would not be permanent. In his own words, by the time the galaxy realizes who they put their power with, it would be far too late. And that was this instance. Even if the Bothans spread the news of the massacre and Sidious's powers in the Force and even spread it across the galaxy, no one could do a thing. If the entire galaxy found out he was a Sith Lord, it wouldn't change anything. But Palpatine didn't exactly get away with this either. The Bothan people did not cower before him, and were instead emboldened to support the rebellion even more. Prior to this, they had only used the spy net as they always had, which was more of a neutral party who favored the highest bidder. But now they used the full power of the spy net to support the Alliance, and would steal the plans for the second Death Star as well. Of course, Palpatine organized for them to do so in order to lure the rebels into a trap, and he would also make them pay heavy casualties for it. However, the Bothans were instrumental to the rebels' success and eventual victory, and they would be founding members of the New Republic afterwards. But this was the incredibly strange time when Palpatine decided to get his own hands dirty for a change, revealing himself as a Sith Lord and slaughtering an entire city. This is one of the instances where Palpatine simply could not help himself. He had stood for so long using so many minions to do his work, but when it came to the Death Star, he didn't take any chances, even with Lord Vader or Grand Moff Tarkin. His rage was so palpable that he had to actually release it on his enemy. He had to watch those responsible perish in front of him. Sidious is a schemer, and ironically he's at his most dangerous when he's hiding in the shadows. But I do wish we got more moments like this, where Sidious decides to throw caution to the wind and display his true power as a true Dark Lord. The concept of the Rule of Two confused the Jedi a great deal, which was likely why it took them so long to begin looking for Darth Sidious. Greetings again, Acolytes, and welcome back to the archives. Some time ago, we released a video where we discussed why the Jedi Council was convinced that Sidious was a myth. But since then, we began to wonder if they didn't believe in Darth Sidious, then who did they think trained Darth Maul? How did they reason that Dooku was a Sith? And why did it take them so long to figure out that Sidious was actually real? Someone in the comments pointed out that they did do some of their own investigations. However, we found not only were they looking in the entirely wrong place, but it was far too little too late. And it all circles around to the concept of the Rule of Two, which utterly baffled the Jedi. So join us as we talk about how Darth Bane's ancient philosophy became the greatest stumbling block for the Jedi High Council. To begin our journey, we'll have to go all the way back to the Jedi's first and their only interaction with Darth Bane. During this time, the Dark Lord and his apprentice Zana were on the world of Tython, as Bane was attempting to uncover the secret of how to rid himself of the parasitic Orbalisk armor that was threatening to take his life. However, the Sith were followed and attacked by a strike team of Jedi warriors, and after an intense duel, the Sith managed to slay every Jedi. But right as Bane was about to finish one of them with Force Lightning, the Jedi summoned the last of their energy to surround Bane in a sort of Force shield. This contained the Force Lightning within the shield, causing Bane to strike himself all over. This charred the Dark Lord's body and rapidly killed the Orbalisks, who began releasing copious amounts of toxin that would kill Bane. To save her master, Zana would rush Bane to her cousin, Darovet, to the planet of Umbria, where the Sith knew of a renowned healer. Once, a long time ago, the healer had saved Darth Bane's life from a poison, but this was only after the Dark Lord threatened to murder his daughter. The healer himself was incredibly mentally resilient and could not be broken with torture, but his daughter proved to be his only weakness. After Bane left the first time, he sent his daughter away to school off-world so that she could be safe. But once Zana returned to have him heal Bane again, the healer refused. Zana was unable to sway him one way or the other because of his mental fortitude, and her master was quickly dying. So in order to garner his help, Zana ended up making a deal with the healer. The man would be willing to help Bane again on one condition, that Zana give herself and her master up to the Jedi. Reluctantly, Zana sent a message directly to the Jedi, but she had a plan. After the healer took care of Bane and saved his life a second time, Zana ultimately slew him. Afterwards, the Dark Lady turned to her own cousin and used her Sith magic to bend his mind to cause him to go insane. As soon as the Jedi strike team landed, Zana took her still unconscious master Bane and hid beneath the floors of the healer's home. The mad cousin sprinted out of the house and attacked the Jedi in a crazed fury. Zana had been very clever to arm him with the lightsaber of one of the Jedi that they had murdered on Tython, and the Jedi team that arrived on Ambria very quickly and easily put down her cousin, killing him on the spot. And because they had no physical description of Bane whatsoever, just his name, the Jedi believed that this pathetic man had in fact been Bane, and that they had finally executed the very last Sith. The Order was entirely ignorant of the Rule of Two for the better part of the next 800 years. As far as the Jedi were concerned, the Sith were extinct once and for all, and the galaxy could finally rest. It wasn't until 181 BBY that a dark Jedi by the name of Kib Jeen spilled the beans. Kib had been a Jedi Padawan that found the cursed fortress of Darth Riven on the planet of Almas. The fortress was so potently imbued with the dark side that it was terraforming the land that surrounded it. The base had gripped the mind of the Padawan Jeen and led him to slay his master. The young Jedi would then go on into the fortress and would use the knowledge within to become a powerful dark side wielder, but not a Sith. He never officially became a Sith, though he did worship them. This worship led to him finding all sorts of dark side cults, and somehow finding out about the Rule of Two's existence. It isn't known whether he interacted with the Sith directly, but it is possible that he did. They could have simply decided to use him as a distraction, but if this were all true, then it backfired horrifically for the Sith. Jeen raised a cult army and made a massive issue that required the attention of the Jedi. They dispatched a consular and her Padawans to go deal with the issue and to bring the Dark Jedi to justice. After doing their work though, the Jedi had stopped his nefarious plan, and they entered a duel with the Dark Jedi and eventually struck him down. On his deathbed though, Jeen muttered some gibberish about the Rule of Two, saying with his dying breath that there were always two Sith, no more and no less. This greatly surprised the Jedi that overheard this, and they all reported it directly to the Council in great detail. They took all of this information and had it recorded within the archives, and though at first the Jedi were concerned, they would ultimately write it off as the babblings of a madman. Jeen had indeed lost his mind in the fortress of Almas. He murdered his own master and became obsessed with the aspects of the dark side. He was unrecognizable at the time of his death, so any credibility to the things that he was saying was called directly into question or dismissed outright. Not to mention, the Jedi were in deep denial about the Sith and their possible return. Their ancient enemies had nearly destroyed the Republic the last time around, and their extinction was met with widespread relief and peace. And so the Jedi were extremely hesitant to raise any alarm bells off of the ramblings of a psychotic cultist. So while they kept the idea of the Rule of Two in mind, they didn't actually look into it at all. But everything changed in the year 32 BBY with the arrival of Maul, which saw the loud and the blatant return of the Sith. When Qui-Gon Jinn faced down the Zabrak on Tatooine, he firsthand felt the power of the dark side, Maul's incredible training. Dark Jedi were one thing, and the Jedi had dealt with them plenty, but only those well-versed in the Jedi arts were capable of contending with one at the lightsaber, let alone a Jedi Master of Qui-Gon Jinn's caliber. The skill that Maul demonstrated was beyond anything that Qui-Gon had ever faced, and he gave the Jedi Master such a run for his money that it left Jinn exhausted when he returned to his ship. In the briefing with the Council, Qui-Gon reported all of this and insisted that he believed that the man could not be anything other than a Sith. Immediately though, both Ki-Adi-Mundi and Mace Windu were skeptical. The Jedi said that it was impossible for the Sith to return without the Jedi having knowledge of it. By this point in the timeline, the Jedi had been at the top of the galaxy for generations. Their arrogance had swelled up to a dangerous degree, as they believed that they were basically infallible. The light side had ruled for so long, and peace had been such an assurance that they did not believe any part of the dark side could exist under the Jedi's watchful eye. Not to mention, they had kept the Jedi Shadows at work this entire time. The Shadows were a sect of the Jedi Sentinel class, whose entire job it was to root out and destroy any traces of the dark side and the Sith, and the fact that the Sith could exist was simply out of the question for the Jedi High Council. But it was Yoda who would show wisdom and humility, pointing out that the dark side made things very difficult to see. This comment seemed to sober up Mace Windu, who declared that the Jedi would pour every bit of their resources into uncovering the truth, and they would make good. The investigation is something that happens off-screen both in the films and in basically all the written material. However, we do have evidence that the Jedi did end up learning about the real Darth Bane. The Book of the Sith contains a collection of works written by the Dark Lords of the Sith throughout the various ages. The Jedi possessed a lot of these works before they fell directly into the hands of Sidious, and the Masters often scribbled annotations in the margins. In Darth Bane's chapter, there are annotations made by Quinlan Vos, showing that the Jedi did acquire Bane's writing at some point during their investigations. Perhaps it was even Quinlan himself who found it. This chapter describes the Rule of Two in great detail, and it even talks about how Bane managed to slip the eye of the Jedi. Notes by Quinlan confirm that the Jedi were aware of the Rule of Two because of the Dark Jedi gene. Also, when Yoda was having a vision of Korriban, he recognized the spirit of the true Darth Bane, and Yoda even stated that he knew who he was. But despite the light being shed on the surface of the Rule of Two, it only served to confuse the Jedi more. At Qui-Gon Jinn's funeral, Mace and Yoda discussed the matter of the Sith's return. This is where they first acknowledged the Rule of Two's legitimacy, but they speculate whether it was the Master or the apprentice that was killed by Obi-Wan. And this is where the big tangle begins. The Sith had become so powerful that the Jedi Council were incapable of discerning who was the Master and who was the apprentice. Later, when Dooku revealed himself as a Sith, many Jedi pinned the title of Master on Dooku. It just made sense. He had been the one to organize the war. He was training many dark side acolytes such as Ventress, though none of the acolytes were Sith, but we digress. And Dooku had proven himself to be insanely powerful, far beyond what the Jedi had thought was possible. And after Dooku managed to fight Yoda himself to stalemate on Geonosis, the Grand Master would later comment about how powerful Dooku had grown. But one thing troubled the Council. The Count mentioned yet another Dark Lord by the name of Sidious, one he alleged was controlling the Republic from behind the scenes. But as the Council considered and debated this new information, they dismissed this claim as impossible. The big reason behind this was because Dooku's own power. Yoda had acclaimed Dooku's new strength in the Force, and so if Dooku were to have a living master, that would imply that this Sith was on a level even beyond Yoda. The thought was too terrifying for the Jedi to consider. But secondly, and more important, the Council declared that if such a being existed on Yoda's level, then they would have certainly sensed their presence, especially since Dooku claimed that the man was right under their nose. It just seemed impossible that someone that powerful could exist without the Jedi's knowledge, and so they ruled Darth Sidious as nothing but a red herring, a lie by Dooku. In Darth Bane's chapter, Quinlan Vos comments something that seemed to show how most of the Jedi saw the Rule of Two. Quinlan writes this: Obi-Wan killed one Sith on Naboo. I think we could end this whole war by wiring out Dooku too. By and large, most Jedi believed that Maul and Dooku fit the Rule of Two model perfectly, and everyone believed that Dooku was the Master. Meanwhile, the Council wasn't so sure because the math didn't add up. Maul had been killed before Dooku turned to the dark side, at least as far as they were aware, and so it couldn't be possible for Dooku to have trained under him. So that rules out Maul as the Master, and Dooku as the apprentice, or vice versa. And another big wrench in their theorizing was the name Darth Tyrannis. Kenobi had come across this name first from Jango Fett, the man who hired him. Then they kept finding Tyrannis' fingerprints on the Separatist army and many underworld dealings. However, they did not know that Dooku and Tyrannis were the same for the entirety of the Clone Wars. The Council concluded that Tyrannis must be this mysterious master who trained Maul and seduced Dooku. The Council chased Tyrannis around, but they could never find him. He always seemed to be one step ahead of them. And of course, they never knew that it was simply Dooku's pseudonym, his Sith name. So for the next 2 years, the Jedi chased their own tail while ignoring the existence of Sidious. This would be until 19 BBY, mere months before the Clone Wars end, when Obi-Wan and Anakin learned that Dooku was Tyrannis on the world of Obadiah. Their discovery was linked with the strange movements of the Separatists, who seemed to know all of the Republic's plans. This prompted the Jedi to reopen investigation into Darth Sidious, and they had done so quietly as to not cause panic in the Senate. But now there was already panic, within the upper levels of the Jedi High Council in fact. They all began a mad dash to search for Sidious right in their own backyard, realizing finally that Sidious was real, and Dooku and Tyrannis were one. The Council even charged Captain Dyne with the help of investigating who this Sidious was, and upon finding Sidious's hideout in the industrial sector of Coruscant known as the Works, Captain Dyne and his squad accompanied Windu and several other Jedi in this investigation. The squad ended up finding a tunnel that led directly to the sublevels of 500 Republica, Palpatine's penthouse apartment. but the investigation was halted by none other than security for the apartment, who held the team up for hours as they were cleared. This was all by Sidious's design, who realized just how close the Jedi were getting to discovering him, and had to enact his plans quickly. Finally, the Jedi and the investigation team was let in, but Sidious's trail disappeared in the middle of the unremarkable Ferrocrete floor, and the numerous other footprints covering the floor masked where it may have been picked up again. And it was at this very moment that General Grievous's invasion of Coruscant began, and the Jedi were forced to retreat and to leave the scene to defend the city. Captain Dine and his companions stayed behind to continue searching though, as they believed it was equally as important for the defense of the city to find Sidious. Their scans led to them finding an elevator which plunged directly into the depths of 500 Republica, and led to a secret vault. Dine attempted to contact Master Windu, but all communications were jammed, and he was unable to reach him. But that was when Sidious revealed himself at last, showing the captain his identity as Darth Sidious, before murdering him there. Shortly after, Palpatine returned to his apartment and assumed his identity as the Chancellor. Raida Shaak Ti and the Jedi team arrived to protect him from Grievous. And as we know, the General himself attacked the apartment in order to capture the Dark Lord, all according to the Chancellor's plan. In the novel Labyrinth of Evil, Mace Windu begins to put the pieces together eventually. This is what the novel reads as Mace travels with Palpatine down a bullet train shaft. How had Grievous known to attack 500 Republica? How had Grievous known? Mace asked to himself. Many Coruscanti knew that Palpatine resided in 500 Republica, but the location of his suite was a well-kept secret. More important, how had Grievous known that Palpatine wasn't to be found in either of his offices? Not everything could be traced to Dooku. It was conceivable that Dooku had furnished Grievous with data, hyperlanes, that skimmed the outer limits of the deep core. Windu knew that much Dooku could have pilfered from the Jedi archives before he left the Order, presumably when he was erasing mentions of Kamino from the databanks as well. Similarly, Dooku could have supplied Grievous with orbital coordinates, specific communications, satellites, and mirrors, or even with tactical information regarding the location of dedicated shield generators on the surface of the world. But Palpatine had only just been elected as Supreme Chancellor when Dooku left Coruscant, when he returned to Sereno. And back then, some 13 years ago, Palpatine had been living in a high-rise tower close to the Senate building. So how had Grievous known to go to 500 Republica? Sidious? If it was all true that hundreds of senators had, for a time, been under the Sith Lord's influence, then he may have had access to the highest levels of confidential information. As many on the Jedi High Council feared, Sidious's network of agents and assets might have infiltrated the Republic military command itself. This suggested that the sneak attack on Coruscant had been years in the planning. Mace caught another glimpse of Palpatine, insulated by the flowing red robes of his hand-picked bodyguards. This was hardly the time to question him about his closest confidants, but Mace would make it his business to find the time later. And briefly, he wondered what had become of Captain Dine's team. It was after this that Windu began to suspect that it had to be someone within Palpatine's own inner circle, someone who was pulling the strings and manipulating Palpatine himself. Perhaps an advisor, or one of his guards. Mace explained the only reason Palpatine himself was not a suspect is because he was the Chancellor, and he already ruled the galaxy. Mace never thought that Sidious's aims were higher than that, but he did admit that the dark side did surround the Chancellor. Soon though, Palpatine began making bolder moves, including electing Anakin to be on the Council, which was a massive overstep of authority. And with Captain Dine missing after the Battle of Coruscant, the Jedi felt that they had no one to turn to, except for Anakin. He was closer to Palpatine than any other Jedi, and since he was the chosen one destined to destroy the Sith, surely he can report on the Chancellor's dealings, and perhaps even root out Sidious. And that's actually exactly what he did, but never in the way that the High Council expected. The Clone Wars looked completely different from every angle it was viewed upon. From a Jedi's perspective, it was a dark era where the light was needed most, a time of compromise in order to secure the safety of the Republic, to stop it from being torn apart. From a politician's perspective, it was a terrifying series of events that required them to gain as much power as possible, harbingering all of the power in the Senate they could muster and keeping their people safe. From a trooper's perspective, it was the duty that they were bred for, but no less of a living hell. From the moment it began in the year 22 BBY, the Clone Wars was destined to change absolutely everything about the galaxy. But then again, there was no winning this type of war, because the entire thing had been a scheme from the very beginning, just a game played by the one man who controlled both sides. But that brings us to an interesting question. What did the Clone Wars actually look like from Palpatine's perspective, the man who could see it all? It is time once again to open up the journals of the Dark Lord himself, and hopefully we can discover how he viewed the titular war that he himself fashioned. Welcome back to the archives, my friends, and let's begin. For Darth Sidious, the Clone Wars was a culmination of everything that he and the Sith had worked so hard for. For 1,000 years, they had been gaining strength, knowledge, and power, not just outward, but within the Republic's inner structure. The greatest strength of the Sith in this era was the network of contacts and business relationships that they had throughout the common public. For too long, the Sith had attempted to attack the Republic and the Jedi from the outside within, using armies and weaponry to their advantage. And for too long, they had simply been repelled by the bulwark of the light side and the unity of the people of the Republic. But now the Sith had evolved. They had chosen to use the Republic as a weapon against the Jedi. In their seat of power, the Jedi Order had grown complacent, perhaps even arrogant. They had served as the Guardians and the Watchmen for so long that they believed that their wisdom was infallible and their doctrine absolute. So long as they guided the Republic, they saw it as invincible. Darth Sidious observed this from the shadows and was disgusted by it, and at the same time, incredibly amused. Growing up in an aristocratic household, having an interest in politics, Sheev Palpatine soon learned that money, connection, and power, that this is what truly runs the galaxy at large. Even the Jedi understand this, as they had evolved themselves very deeply within the Senate. Despite being peacekeepers allegedly devoted to trusting the Force for its guidance, the Jedi allowed the Senate and the Chancellor to dictate who they could and could not help. At the same time, Palpatine noticed a growing dissatisfaction among the Outer Rim worlds of the Republic. Bureaucrats had manipulated galactic policy to ensure that the core and the mid-rim worlds were getting priority treatment, essentially leaving the Outer Rim to basically fend for itself. Because of this, pirates and crime lords now ruled that area now. Laws were so sparsely enforced that there was a blind eye that was turned to even slavery. So much so that the Outer Rim systems were forced to make compromising deals with the greedy Trade Federation in order to actually receive supplies and the protection that they needed. No Republic existed out there. But those deals essentially handed over full control of the systems and their political standing to the Trade Federation, allowing the corporation to grow in immense power within the Senate. The Supreme Chancellor did little to mitigate this out of fear of the Trade Federation's incredible political power as well. And the Jedi did nothing because the Senate did nothing. Trust in the core worlds of the Republic then rapidly dwindled as a result of this, and the Outer Rim grew to hate them. For Sidious, the tides of the galaxy had shifted now in massive favor of the Sith. This was the dark side of the Force providing them with a golden opportunity, one that they had waited for 1,000 years to see. Working closely with his master Plagueis, the two engineered the Naboo blockade crisis. This event caused further distrust in the Outer Rim, providing an avenue for Sidious to then manipulate Queen Amidala into calling a vote of no confidence for Chancellor Valorum. Palpatine had already made himself incredibly likable to the public with the help of Plagueis. This enabled him to get a sympathy vote from the Senate, and receive the office as Supreme Chancellor, as he of course was from Naboo. Darth Maul killing Qui-Gon Jinn ridded Palpatine of a potential dangerous threat to his plan, as Qui-Gon had been a rare and an insightful Jedi who listened to the living Force rather than Jedi dogma. Qui-Gon Jinn's clarity of mind could have allowed him to perceive Palpatine's influence, but the death of the Jedi Master also served to create an impactful return of the Sith, something that completely unbalanced the Jedi. Not only this, but it brought Jedi Master Dooku to the dark side, enabling him to become Palpatine's next apprentice. And with Dooku came the avenue to create the war that Palpatine desired, that he had seen in his dreams. The Clone Wars was not the end goal, but this was the primary catalyst. In Palpatine's personal journals, he has a section called The False War. In this section, he explains his plans and his intentions. The book reads this: "Fear was a necessary component in destroying the Jedi, burning away the putrefying vestiges of the Republic. But first, I had to create that fear. Fear of revolution, of destruction, a fear of death. I had to create a war on a massive scale. My apprentice Dooku rallied star systems under his banner, inflaming passions among Rim citizens. This naturally deepened the fears of core residents, who clamored for protection like brushnits mewing for their mothers. The clone army that I had prepared was met with applause and relief. And thus began the Clone Wars. Creating the army was the easy part. The difficult part was engineering the circumstances where it could be accepted. For a millennium at this point, the Republic had completely disbanded all formal military emplacements. This came as one of the conditions of the famous Ruusan Reformation. The Republic wanted to stand as a democracy of peace, a government that will accept all systems into the fold. It was believed that having a centralized military would make them come off as a hostile regime to other worlds that were not yet a part of the wider Republic, and so they relied on the independent planetary defense forces for any issues that arose in specific sectors. And of course, they also heavily relied on the Jedi. But with an entire section of the Republic now seceding and becoming the Confederacy of Independent Systems, or the Separatists, war was on the horizon. The core worlds could not worry about wanting to come off as peaceful when an enemy was marching to their door with an entire droid army. But the defense of the Republic was not on Palpatine's mind when he engineered the clones. Palpatine needed skilled, obedient soldiers that would do exactly what he needed from them. He charged Darth Tyrannis with finding the perfect specimen for that genetic template, and Dooku remembered someone from his past, the Mandalorian bounty hunter Jango Fett. Dooku would tell Sidious the story of how he witnessed Fett kill 6 Jedi with nothing but his bare hands. This information pleased Sidious, who had Dooku test Jango before recruiting him as a prime clone. Depending on the continuity, this would be where the Sith Lords devised the idea of the inhibitor chip. That would be in canon. In Legends, Order 66 was a contingency only taught to high-ranking clones through rigorous mental conditioning. From the clone army came a battle fleet and an arsenal of newly mechanized weapons of war. Overnight, the Republic had a class of military elites who swore their loyalty only to the Supreme Chancellor. By the time this was all over, Palpatine had a ready-made military for his new empire that was already battle-hardened, and more important, loyal. Dooku, meanwhile, would essentially be the one who acted as Sidious's liaison. This was why the Jedi doubted that Darth Sidious actually ever existed, because Dooku was the man who was behind everything, at least as far as the Jedi could tell. Tyrannis carried out Palpatine's order to the letter, and those orders were relayed every now and then by various different means. According to Yoda Dark Rendezvous, the very first few years of Dooku's apprenticeship, he rarely ever actually saw his master Sidious. Dooku's orders were given to him through encrypted messages, or holonet feeds. He only ever saw the man in person whenever they had their training sessions in the unpopulated Coruscant Industrial District. Eventually though, of course, this would change, and Palpatine started appearing to Dooku through hologram more often, just as he had with Viceroy Gunray, bounty hunters, and General Grievous. Leading his double life was actually not a very difficult one. Within Palpatine's inner circle was Mas Amedda, Sly Moore, and they were of course aware of his identity as a Sith Lord. Whenever he needed to leave the Chancellor's office to conduct business as Sidious, the two of them would always cover for him. Oftentimes it was Mas Amedda doing his duty as the Grand Vizier, mainly deterring questions about the Chancellor's whereabouts with carefully crafted lies. The place where Palpatine recorded his instructions as Sidious is somewhat unknown, and was greatly varied. Palpatine had closed off places in the Senate office with communication arrays, but we suspect that a lot of it was done from his penthouse or on board his private yacht. But no matter where Sidious conducted his business, he always did so with masterful secrecy, because not only was he able to send and receive his secret transmissions under the Jedi Order's nose, but he also conducted plenty of dark side rituals under their nose as well. In the very strange comic titled Sithosis, we are shown Palpatine carrying out a bizarre ritual, one where he strengthens the dark side of the Force through the galaxy. He forces the tide of a battle to turn against the Jedi in certain places, and in the comic, he even inflames the rage of Anakin Skywalker on the battlefield, drawing him into his passion while fighting the Separatists, giving into his rage. Now we learn that this was a part of a greater ritual. Palpatine would do all of this before getting dressed as the Chancellor, and to enter a Senate meeting as the kindly old Palpatine. But it's not as though he actually needed Sith magic to enforce his will on the war. Palpatine was, after all, the puppet master of it all, pulling strings from both armies. In his own personal journal, he states that every Republic victory was followed with a carefully planned defeat. It was all analyzed. Being the master of both sides of the war, Palpatine knew every single placement of the Republic and the CIS. He would move them around accordingly to get the outcome that he desired. At one point, Dooku admitted that he thought Sidious's plans were needlessly complicated, but Dooku was always surprised at the outcome. Dooku believed that he could actually win the war legitimately, taking the Separatists to the heart of the Republic and crushing their forces on Coruscant. But Palpatine had other plans. He didn't want the Jedi simply defeated in a war, because then they would die as martyrs and heroes defending peace to the very last man. Palpatine needed to destroy their image. As a new incarnation of the Sith, Sidious knew that defeating the Jedi was not as simple as wiping them all out. He had to completely squash the public's trust, their perception of them, and not just the public's, but the Jedi's perception of themselves. This is what Palpatine would write. The Jedi did not want war, but they had little choice. They had to join the fight lest they face public scorn. There, on the front lines, my war struck down my enemies, shredded their morals until they were on the brink of the dark side. The Jedi were never the true heroes. I saw that by manipulating the HoloNet, the people were led to fear the Jedi's arrogance and their strange power. By crafting the news, the clone troopers and their noble Chancellor became the fearless heroes of the Republic. And when the time came for the Jedi to be eliminated, the public would not mourn them. When the Senate learned that the Jedi had attempted a coup and needed to be exterminated, they responded with absolute clarity and certainty. And when the people saw smoke rising from the Jedi Temple, they felt relief. Manipulation was his whole state of being during the Clone War. Palpatine did it to literally everyone to siphon away their power, to make himself stronger. His public perception was so high that the people of the galaxy believed that he was the only one that could save them, the only one that could turn things around, and so they began giving him more and more power, which extended his term and gave him reach into every branch of the government. The representatives in the Senate feared that being painted as disloyal would make them unelectable, so they supported measures to dismantle all checks of centralized power and to give it all to Palpatine. On the opposite side of things, the Trade Federation, the Commerce Guild, and other corporate conglomerates joined together to protect their own profit. They unknowingly pledged their allegiance though to the Sith. Through Dooku, he ensured that the Geonosians began construction of the Death Star. And when some of the plans were discovered by Republic war generals, Palpatine used fear to make them think it was a separatist weapon, convincing them to build it instead as a secret Republic project away from the eyes of the Jedi. Another brilliant move by Palpatine during the war that many don't think of. Palpatine even went so far as to control the entire underworld of the galaxy during the Clone Wars. He left no stone unturned and put the Hutts, spy networks, Black Sun Syndicate, and even the Bounty Hunters Guild in his pocket. But none were manipulated more than his enemy, the Jedi, and of course, Grandmaster Yoda himself. This is what Palpatine has to say about this. All beings want to make sense of their reality, but none of them wish to think too deeply. They gravitate towards words that confirm their existing suspicions. In my decades as ambassador, senator, and chancellor, I did not once encounter an exception to this rule. It was the truth. Whether I was reminding the Senate of the need for war powers, or sitting across from Master Yoda and convincing him to send more Jedi Knights into harm's way. None suspected the duplicity of my identity. In fact, so convinced were the Jedi of their superior insight that they were the easiest to deceive. When you boil it down, Palpatine's perspective on the Clone Wars was exhausting work. Hours upon hours wearing different masks, days upon days of draining power from everyone possible, setting off payoffs that he may not see until years later, all while having to dodge Jedi suspicions and to rid himself of potentially dangerous enemies that were getting too curious about him. And if Palpatine got any spare time at all, it was dedicated to stoking Anakin's ego, sowing seeds of distrust for him for the future. Palpatine's views on the Clone Wars was him having one eye on a massive spreadsheet and the other eye over his shoulder. This isn't even counting a few wrenches being thrown into his plans, such as Padme actively opposing the gathering of his power in the Senate, and his frustrating inability to get rid of her. Also, the return of his former apprentice Maul. That situation was so shocking to him that he had to make an extremely rare appearance to deal with it personally. As Darth Sidious, that was a threat directly to his status as the Dark Lord, a direct threat to the rule of two, and Palpatine knew that he needed to deal with it the way that the ancients would. I also suppose it was rare and a special bit of fun for Palpatine to cross sabers in person, giving him a much needed break from having to scheme and rely on the manipulation of others to do his bidding. And with that, my friends, that's the real threat of Darth Sidious. It's not even his power in the Force, but it's his unmatched brilliance, specifically with the Clone Wars. However, he was unable to replicate it with the Empire. I believe that the Clone Wars itself was Palpatine's magnum opus, his masterpiece. And while the Empire was disappointing in many respects, Darth Sidious was always meant to be a conqueror. And Palpatine pulled this off by nearly operating completely out of the shadows. Why did Dooku choose to reveal the Sith to Obi-Wan Kenobi on Geonosis? Greetings, and welcome back Acolytes and lore junkies alike. The archives have been expecting you. When Obi-Wan was snooping around on Geonosis, he caught the former Jedi Master Dooku conspiring with the Separatists to secede from the Republic itself. Upon Kenobi being caught, however, Dooku would visit him in his holding cell. He mentioned how this entire thing was a misunderstanding, before dropping the bombshell that a Sith Lord by the name of Darth Sidious had infiltrated the Senate and was controlling the Republic. This was not only the truth, but it was also the very first time the Jedi Order would hear the name Darth Sidious. At the time, Dooku mentioned that Obi-Wan should join him, help him crush this Sith threat. This is a very strange thing for Dooku to do as a Sith Lord. Had he not revealed Sidious here, the plans of the Sith may have been further veiled from the Jedi, but instead, he took this risk. Many have come to believe that this offer to Obi-Wan was genuine, that he truly wanted to help in betraying his new master Sidious. But as Yoda always says, the dark side clouds everything, and not all is as it seems with this interaction. In today's Holocron upload, we are going to discuss why Dooku revealed that Darth Sidious was in fact real, and revealed him to the Jedi, and why Palpatine ordered him to do it. The subject of who Darth Sidious was to the Jedi is a fascinating topic with many layers. For 3 years, the Jedi were caught in a knot of confusion. They struggled to accept whether or not Sidious was even real. In the recent months, we've explored this topic from several different angles. We've talked about why the Jedi believed that Sidious was a myth, why they were confused by the structure of the Rule of Two. We even explored how the Jedi eventually found out Sidious was real, and how they almost caught him due to a slip-up by Viceroy Gunray of all people. But before we get into this subject, and to let it rest, we wanted to go all the way back to the roots of the entire thing. The moment that Dooku tells Obi-Wan the truth of Darth Sidious. There exists an idea surrounding this scene, one that insists that Dooku was showing the last vestiges of his righteousness by doing this. We've heard many state that if Obi-Wan had only taken this offer, they may have betrayed Sidious successfully, and even brought Dooku back to the light. Could this be true? If we know one thing about Dooku, is that he's an incredibly complex man, one with a compelling journey to the dark side and layered motivation. He had a difficult relationship with the Jedi once they began becoming overly political. He observed how the High Council bent the knee to the will of the Senate that was full of corrupt politicians. Big corporations and greedy schemes were lining the pockets of the senators, causing stagnation in the imposing of rule of law. This caused injustice to reign supreme in the galaxy, and because the ever-squabbling Senate could never reach a consensus, one of two things kept happening. Either the Jedi Order sat back and did nothing, shirking their duties as peacekeepers while innocents suffered and died, or the Jedi were sent on missions that should have been solved by a military, resulting in needless Jedi casualties. Dooku was already infuriated by all of this, but then there was Qui-Gon Jinn, his Padawan, his friend. When he was executed by Maul, everything changed. Filled with sorrow and vengeance, Dooku departed the Jedi Order and contemplated hunting down Sidious himself. That was until Palpatine approached him personally and revealed his true identity. The two had a deep discussion where they realized their goals and aims for the galaxy were actually not so different. Both desired to have peace and order imposed on a chaotic galaxy, but this could not happen so long as the Jedi were in power, acting like the lapdogs of a corrupt institution. And long story short, Dooku was inducted into the Order of Sith Lords, given the name Darth Tyrannis. So why did we mention all of this? It's to demonstrate the well-known fact that Dooku is not like other Sith Lords. The Jedi were correct in assuming that he was a political idealist, but they didn't think he had the capacity for real evil. In truth, there was a time when he didn't, and so many have come to assume that Dooku was never truly a Sith Lord to begin with. He may have allied himself with Sidious and called himself Sith, but he lacked the Sith yellow eyes. He avoided killing Jedi personally, at least at the beginning of the war, and he seemed to vouch for justice. But that's just the reason that many jumped to the conclusion that was offered to Obi-Wan, and the fact that it could have been genuine. He knew Sidious was evil and had to be taken down. He just wanted to do it his way, and to have the Padawan of his Padawan, basically his metaphorical grandson, by his side to do all of it. This is a heartwarming way to view this scene, where Dooku pleads with Obi-Wan to join him. Unfortunately though, it is also naive. The reality of the situation is far more sinister. Dooku may have had the purest of intentions starting, but the dark side corrupts all. No amount of heroics can change what the dark side does to a person when its venom infiltrates their mind and their spirit. For 10 years, Dooku trained with Sidious and embraced the dark side. He gave himself over to his rage and his hatred. He was even amused at the idea that Yoda would call it perfecting evil. Dooku may have once championed justice, but he now only used that part of himself as a facade. In truth, he hated beings lesser than him. He thought of those who used prosthetics like Anakin as half-human abominations. He despised non-human species, and thought of the beings of the galaxy as a hive mind of insects in need of a strong hand to rule them. He wanted to replace the Jedi Order with a dark mirror, instate a Sith army where he was the Grand Master. Dooku became a snake who enjoyed cruelty, and by the end of his life, he personally murdered dozens of Jedi by his own hands, and thousands of innocents. We say all of this to dismiss the idea that he had any heroic motivations when he revealed Sidious. In fact, the entire thing had been one big ploy concocted by Sidious himself. Quite appropriate. In the book aptly named Labyrinth of Evil, we get many in-depth insights on the twisted maze of a plan that Sidious has created. The Jedi are closer than ever to finding the identity of the Sith Lord, and Obi-Wan and Anakin are following Palpatine's winding trail of yarn all the way back to its source. It is within this book where we get to peer into the thoughts of Dooku, who is scrambling around to rectify the mistakes which could lead to Sidious's exposure. The two Sith Lords meet on Coruscant. They discuss how they can turn situations like this to their benefit. And it is in this conversation that Dooku references Geonosis to Sidious. This is what the novel reads. Sidious had the ability to see deep into the future, but there was always the unexpected. With the power of the dark side, however, came flexibility. Having traced Fett to Kamino, Obi-Wan Kenobi had turned up on Geonosis. All at once, here was Qui-Gon Jinn's former Padawan, right under Dooku's nose. But when he had informed Sidious of Obi-Wan's presence there, Sidious had only said, "Allow events to play out, Darth Tyrannis, for our plans are unfolding exactly as I have foreseen. The Force is very much with us." Dooku did not keep it hidden from his master that his grandson was on Geonosis snooping around. He did not try to take the opportunity to turn on Sidious, because for the longest time, Dooku was deceived into believing that he and Palpatine had a real, genuine partnership, and so he obeyed almost everything that Sidious said, following his plans to the letter. He highly respected the fact that not only was Palpatine talented in foresight, but unlike the Jedi, he actually used it to change events, to take hold of the future. And that's why he trusted Sidious, even when his master ordered him to reveal himself to the Jedi. Labyrinth of Evil then goes on to say this. On Geonosis, he had deliberately allowed them to pursue him, just as Sidious had instructed him to do. Also as instructed, Dooku had made Obi-Wan aware of the existence of Darth Sidious, as a means of confusing the Jedi by telling them the truth. We talked about how Dooku used the truth to confuse and to misdirect the Jedi before, but it definitely bears repeating. By brazenly throwing the truth at the Jedi, Dooku knew that the High Council would debate themselves into stagnation. If Dooku was telling the truth, then why? What did he have to gain by betraying his master? It only makes sense that such claims were false, as it seemed impossible for a Sith Lord to be right under their nose without them having sensed it at all. Yoda ordered for the Senate to be thoroughly searched, and they secretly subjected as many senators as possible to the most extensive questioning that they could manage. But all of their investigations turned up nothing, and they couldn't go further without risking a major scandal. Then of course, even if they decided that Sidious was real or not, they were still trying to decide whether Maul had been the master or the apprentice in the Rule of Two dynamic, and they were still investigating who Darth Tyrannis was. Throwing a third Sith name in the mix violated everything they knew about the Rule of Two. Again in Labyrinth of Evil, Yoda and Obi-Wan have a discussion where they are frustrated by not knowing the sequential order of who trained who in the mix of Maul, Dooku, and Sidious. Dooku also knew of the Council's great arrogance, and he had managed to duel Yoda to a stalemate, proving that he was on par with Yoda's level of skill and power, at least in his own mind. And after Dooku claimed that he had a master, this absolutely petrified the Jedi High Council. The Council refused to believe that any Darksider stronger than Dooku could exist without them having sensed it first, and to suggest that person was not only running around but doing so right under their noses in the Senate was beyond ludicrous to them. So although it seemed majorly counterintuitive for Dooku to tell them straight up what was actually occurring, it actually worked perfectly into the Sith's hands. While the Jedi were tying themselves in a mental knot, it only served to cloud their judgment and their vision in the Force. The Sith's motives and movements remained obscure, and by the time the Jedi believes the truth of it, it was far too late. And so our point today was that Dooku's revelation of Sidious to Obi-Wan was not one made out of a desire to serve the light in his own way. He wasn't making heroic plans against a powerful master. In fact, Dooku was doing his master's bidding. It was all a ploy to weave a web of confusion. All of it was a master plan orchestrated by Sidious. Again, which is very much par for the course. After capturing Obi-Wan Kenobi on Geonosis, Dooku would reveal to him that a Sith Lord by the name of Darth Sidious was currently in control of the Republic. At the time, Obi-Wan called him a liar and stated that to be impossible. However, Obi-Wan would later return to the High Council with news revealed to him by the new Sith Lord. Despite this big revelation, the Council was dubious, as Obi-Wan believed this to be a misdirection, and for the majority of the Clone Wars, the Jedi Council didn't actually believe that Sidious existed at all. It was only until the very last few months of 19 BBY did they actually begin hunting down the mysterious Sidious. This brought up many questions in our mind though. Why did Dooku so hastily reveal Sidious's plan? Why didn't the Jedi even bother investigating these claims? Why did they write off Sidious as a lie so quickly? And had Dooku predicted all of this? Well, in today's Holocron, we wanted to explore these questions in great detail, as this one revelation by the Count could have saved the entire Jedi Order. But because of several strange factors, the Order doomed itself by believing that Sidious was simply a myth. But while the Jedi didn't heed this truth right away, there are many pieces of knowledge in the lore waiting to be revealed. Do not make the same mistake of the Jedi Council. Force crush that subscribe button and join us as we lay bare the secrets of the galaxy every single day. Now, Acolytes, let us begin. Let's first begin at the obvious, Dooku's thought process on Geonosis. During the events of Attack of the Clones, the Jedi had firmly decided that it wasn't in Dooku's nature to be a killer. He was a former Jedi, one of the honorable Lost 20, and he was simply a political activist. But when Obi-Wan eavesdropped on the Confederate meeting, he did not suspect Dooku was an actual Sith Lord at the time. Kenobi listening to Dooku's conspiracy made him think of the man as a political traitor, but not an agent of evil. When he was captured, Dooku decided to leverage this information to approach him as an old friend, cordially, with respect, and even some reverence for Qui-Gon. The Count had great respect for Obi-Wan. He was the Padawan of his own Padawan. In a way, Obi-Wan was Dooku's proverbial grandson, and wanting nothing more for him to join the cause and be spared of the Jedi's ignorance and destruction. But Obi-Wan, now knowing that Dooku was behind the attempts of Padme's life, was conspiring to raise an army against the Republic. Obi-Wan flatly refused. That's when Dooku decided to pull out a trap card. He would blatantly reveal that the Republic was under the control of a Sith Lord Darth Sidious. This was his truth. The Count was well aware of who Palpatine was, but it seems odd for him to reveal this to a Jedi outright. But what we have come to discover is this is actually a stroke of genius. By revealing this information so soon, no matter how Obi-Wan reacted to it, Dooku believed that he could not lose. If Kenobi believed him and joined him, Dooku would gain the ally that he so eagerly sought. But if the opposite happened, and Obi-Wan did not believe him, then Dooku's revelation would be more like a lie. It would appear as nothing more than misdirection. The Count was well aware of the arrogance of the Council. They would never believe such a thing after the Sith had been gone for 1,000 years. The very idea was preposterous to them. Much to Dooku's displeasure though, the latter option came to light, and Obi-Wan did not believe his claim. He was greatly disappointed to not be able to join with his grandson, the last vestige of Qui-Gon Jinn. But nevertheless, Dooku had still won. He accurately predicted the Jedi would not believe him because of how readily he offered that information. Then of course, it was later revealed that Dooku himself was a Sith, and Yoda would duel him and confirm for himself that the dark side of the Force was present within his former Padawan and friend, a former paragon of light. As for why the Jedi Council did not believe in the Sidious though, this was a direct result of Yoda's discovery. When Yoda fought Dooku, he felt for himself the power of his old apprentice, the new power. The utilization of Force lightning disturbed Yoda, as he got to see firsthand that Dooku was not bluffing when he claimed that he was Sith. While the Grandmaster neutralized the Count's Force abilities, they soon reached an impasse which could only be solved at the lightsaber. When they crossed blades, they were basically even matched. Neither could overwhelm the other, forcing Dooku to distract Yoda and flee. The Jedi Master had dueled his apprentice countless times in the past, and he'd never before seen Dooku at this peak. This not only upset the Grand Master, but it also worried the entire Jedi Council. At the time, it was unthinkable that anyone could match Yoda. Before Yoda had given a lesson by having 3 members of the Jedi Council, Plo Koon, Sei Tin, and Depa Billaba, attack him all at one time. But Yoda dodged all of their strikes while barely moving, and simply used the Force to guide their blades away from him. It was generally accepted that Yoda was untouchable, and yet the Jedi Grandmaster had been unable to defeat Dooku on Geonosis, and came back explaining and claiming just how powerful he had really become. With this in mind, they could not, or rather would not believe that Dooku had a master, because that would mean that there was someone beyond Yoda. In this era, the Count was the strongest Darksider that any Jedi had encountered for hundreds of years. To admit that there was a being greater than him would be to open a discussion that a Sith Lord existed that could rival or even surpass Yoda. This was not a conversation that the Jedi wanted to have. It was so unthinkable that they had to dismiss it as a lie for their own sanity, and at the time, the only being they found with the midichlorian Count matching, or higher than the Grand Master, was Anakin Skywalker, the being that was currently theorized to be the chosen one of legend. So they thought that Dooku was just lying. If another existed with the same power of the Force that was an anomaly on the level of Yoda and Anakin, the Council decided that they would have already found him. It would have been a beacon to them in the Force, and the Jedi Seekers would have undoubtedly brought this being to be trained as a Jedi years ago. But what they did not count on was something discovered by another decades earlier. Darth Plagueis discovered that Sheev Palpatine had a strange ability, a natural affinity towards concealing his presence in the Force. Even Darth Plagueis had a difficult time detecting the boy's power, even when he was standing right in front of him, and even then he needed to be pushed. Plagueis put Palpatine through a test to get him to reveal his latent power, and it was this, along with the bribes from his father Kasinga Palpatine, that kept Sheev undetected by the Jedi. But let's go back to the Jedi. When we take into account the implications of Yoda's discovery, along with the fact that Dooku said that Sidious was controlling the Republic, you begin to see how the Council saw that this was all far too far-fetched. The idea that not only this being slipped their radar for so long, but was now controlling things in their backyard was simply absurd to them. In their blind arrogance, they didn't think that their all-seeing eye in the Force would have been able to overlook this whatsoever. But here is the one final factor that made Sidious mythical to them, and that was Darth Tyrannis. For the first 3 years of the Clone Wars, the Jedi were chasing the wrong Sith Lord. They did not know that Count Dooku and Darth Tyrannis were the same person until the year 19 BBY. This was when Anakin and Obi-Wan followed Sifo-Dyas' trail to Obadiah. It was there where they discovered that Dooku had killed the Jedi Master Sifo-Dyas and taken his identity to create the clone army, and so too did he don the moniker Tyrannis. The Jedi at the time were aware of the rule of two, but they didn't place any stock in it until Maul arrived. We have a script on this coming, by the way. At that time, they did not know whether Maul was the master or the apprentice. But when the name Tyrannis began being thrown around, given by Jango Fett, the Jedi began to think that this Tyrannis either trained Maul or was Maul's apprentice. And thereafter, he had trained Dooku in the ways of the dark side. So when Dooku decided to mention a completely new name, offering the name Sidious to the Jedi, they dismissed it as an outright lie because all they knew was Tyrannis. The rule of two would not permit Sidious, Tyrannis, and Dooku to exist at one time, but eventually it was revealed that Dooku and Tyrannis were one and the same, and this threw the Jedi into a panic. Suddenly things began to make much more sense, and their eyes were opened to a horrific truth. Sidious was not mythical at all, but he was the master. Somehow the war dragged on, and the enemy seemed to know their plans. The Senate was rife with corruption, and Palpatine was staying in power long after his term had expired. In the novel for Revenge of the Sith, Mace Windu reveals to Obi-Wan that he and Yoda theorized that Sidious was puppeteering the Chancellor from behind the scenes. They even caught the scent of Darth Sidious, and they began following this trail, tracing him all the way through an underground passageway, one that led to the address 500 Republica, Palpatine's penthouse. Because of reasons we've covered before though, they did not suspect that Palpatine himself was Sidious, but that Sidious was either in his personal entourage or even disguised as a personal guard. But now their worst fears were coming true. Dooku was not lying, Sidious was real, and he was stronger than Tyrannis. He had been there all along, engineering the entirety of the war. For what reason he had not revealed himself, the Jedi had no clue, but they did know that they controlled Palpatine. Windu said as much when he mentioned that the dark side of the Force surrounded the Chancellor, and in light of these discoveries, Windu became paranoid, radicalized, imperatively stating that the Jedi should forcefully take control of the office of the Chancellor. Yoda, however, would not budge. Yoda said they needed proof. This disagreement sowed discourse between the two of them, and they spent a lot of time arguing on how to go about rooting out Darth Sidious. But all this did was stifle any action, allowing Sidious to keep moving. Eventually, the High Council decided that the only way to dig out Sidious was to kill Dooku, capture or eliminate Grievous, and then win the war. With the Separatist threat quelled, the Jedi would demand Palpatine give up his powers and step down. If he didn't, he would be forcefully removed, provoking Sidious to reveal himself. But this plan would simply utterly fail. as they never suspected Palpatine was actually Darth Sidious all along until Windu's last moments. My empire, so perfect in vision, has at times proved infuriating in its implementation because of the sloth and the stupidity of my underlings. These were the words of Darth Sidious upon looking back at his old writings. When he first was writing his manifesto, he had dreams of grandeur for what the empire would become, what it would represent. It was to be the culmination of everything the Sith had worked so hard to achieve. But once it finally happened, Sidious became bored. While it had always been in his dreams to impose harsh order on the galaxy, the foolishness of his underlings and the emptiness of his victory filled him with a sense of ennui that he later takes out on Lord Vader. He foresaw every avenue that would lead him to his ultimate victory, but it seems that he did not foresee the ultimate boredom that he would experience with his own success. It's time to once again open the holocrons, my friends. But before we do, we can perceive nightmares of great boredom in your future. To deter this, we encourage you to force crush that subscribe button so that you'll always be entertained with the knowledge from a galaxy far, far away in our new holocrons. But now, acolytes, let's begin. Many would have thought it impossible, the Sith winning, but they actually did. After 1,000 years of the rule of two philosophy instated by Darth Bane, they both destroyed and remade the Sith into something entirely new. It thrust them into a metamorphosis that the Jedi were unable to predict. The Sith emerged from the chrysalis as politicians, bankers, and financial powerhouses within the Republic. And the final spear thrust out of all of this was Palpatine himself. He took advantage of all of the resources gathered by his predecessors, all of the spies, the underground contacts, benefactors, information networks, all towards getting himself in a position of total power. He was the Chancellor of the Republic, and he played the Jedi as fools. He had them chasing ghosts and shadows while engineering an entire war that controlled both sides. And at long last, he got the honor of delivering the coup de grace with the corruption of the Jedi's own chosen one, Order 66, in an impassioned speech, one that caused the Republic to fall and proved that the Jedi would be no more. Now he had everything. Total control of the Republic, forming it into the final Sith Empire, the Jedi extinguished, and total galactic dominance. The echoing rhythm of his armies marching, it all resonated on the surface of every world that he commanded. Order would be imposed, and those that resisted would be silenced. At last the Sith ruled the galaxy, a dream that had been 7,000 years in the making. And Palpatine himself could do anything and everything that he wanted. Growing up as a child on Naboo, he had always hated the eccentric fashion and blinding colors of his people. He preferred things to be much more uniform. Black, whites, and grays should be the only thing worn by those who served him. Things such as ornate jewelry, beauty, it was all meaningless unless they contained some sort of power that could serve him. Now Sidious could make things the way that he truly wanted them to be. And yet, it was all for naught. We spoke of this once before, but Sidious was incredibly disappointed by his own empire. The first and the most glaring reason for this was because of the incompetence of his underlings. In his own chapter in the Book of the Sith, Palpatine wrote about how he'd enforce order through ruling by fear. But 20 years after writing this, much time would pass, and in 0 BBY, Palpatine would actually revisit this text and make annotations on the side. He would reflect upon his expectations that he had for the Empire and what it had ultimately become. In his own words, "At the time I wrote these words, I hoped my empire would provide limitless reach. Yet I must still rely on others to do my bidding now, and they are so often foolish, flawed, and disappointing." Palpatine continued to make more cutting remarks about those that served him, and how they were weak to grasp the principle of ruling by fear. Too weak to grasp it. It is maddening, educating this rabble. With the Empire now nearly a generation old, my Imperial Governor should at least understand the principle of the law of fear. Yet, I would have better success trying to teach Arabesh to a Gungan. Only Grand Moff Tarkin truly understood this principle, and his Sith-like ruthlessness was enough to keep him close. He was effective in a way that no one else was. Sidious had hoped that by inspiring competition among his underlings, that they would become more cunning and more ruthless. By allowing bureaucratic infighting among his followers, though, the idea was that they would either rise to the occasion and above the challenge and become even more ruthless than Tarkin, or they would be replaced by someone stronger. This was always the Sith way of ensuring only the strongest remained, and the weak cold. However, the reality was that weak men were able to leverage their power and wealth in the Empire to oppress and to silence the strong. This left cowards and complacent fools in positions of power, such as the experience that Thrawn had when attempting to climb the ranks as an alien. While Palpatine recognized his great skill though, he either didn't care enough to fix it or couldn't come up with a sufficiently Sith-like solution that he was pleased with. The Jedi Hunters also exhausted him. He saw the Inquisitors as idiots that could barely handle their own lightsabers, let alone their job. In the book he writes this: Grand Inquisitor Torben is the latest of these fools to perish. A bomb, a speeder crash, drowning, in their death. The Inquisitors are making a mockery of their empire's infallibility. And so because of all of this, the Emperor becomes bored. It's not as though he gives up by any means though, but he grows weary and retreats into isolation, choosing to spend his time studying the depths of the dark side and Sith rituals and practices. Palpatine does not indulge in wealth or luxury despite being the richest figure in galactic history. At the level he was on, money literally now meant nothing. The only currency that mattered was that of power, and even that lost its thrill once he obtained all of it. He actually follows in the steps of Vitiate before him, choosing to close himself off from the galaxy and work on a backup empire in the background, because Sidious came to realize something that Vitiate also did. At some point, the Sith path does end. Sith inherently are engineered to conquer, and even though Sidious thought of himself as someone destined to rule, he ended up finding it to be the most unfulfilling part of the entire journey. The way of the Sith is to always seek struggle so that you can overcome it, and infinitely evolve. But once he reaches the apex of his power, there was no one who could truly challenge him. In the end, the Sith ideology is ultimately empty once it is fulfilled. Of course, Sidious refused to admit all of this though. It was in his nature to always be scheming, plotting. But as far as entertainment goes, he no longer had the Jedi to keep him amused with their ignorance. When he was Chancellor, it was thrilling for him to be in a room with the most powerful enemies in the galaxy without a single one of them knowing who he really was. He placed Sith art all around his office to mock them, and they were none the wiser. The satisfaction he got from all of this is unmatched. But now that he didn't have to hide, there was a certain freedom for sure, but the excitement was gone from all of his life as well. Having an enemy constantly to duel with, to match his wits against, was stimulating for Sidious, rewarding, and we believe that this was when he turned his attention to Lord Vader. In contrast to the Emperor, Darth Vader did find purpose in the Empire. By becoming the Fist of Palpatine, Vader was able to bury his grief and duty. He flushed all of the past out of his mind by totally committing to keeping the galaxy obedient, in order, something that Skywalker had dreamed of. He got enrichment and fulfillment by serving the needs of the Empire and the dark side, to the point where Vader became religiously devoted to it by the time of A New Hope. But not only this, Vader got to prove his strength over the Jedi and over the enemies of the new regime. Sidious has once mentioned that he also somewhat was disappointed by Vader. Despite him being the Emperor's minor masterpiece, Palpatine found Vader to be often weak and indecisive. But having said that, Sidious could not deny his effectiveness. He spent a considerable amount of time and effort breaking Vader out of his melancholy and putting him back in shape. He believed that Vader's limitations were mental rather than physical, and he had determined to reawaken the power latent within him by becoming the object of Vader's own hatred. Once this was accomplished, Palpatine set out to making Vader the most feared being in the galaxy. His helmet would be the face of the Sith, even if that wasn't something that was publicly confirmed. In his opinion, it did not matter what people really thought Vader was, just as long as they feared him. To Palpatine, if people saw how powerful Vader was, and then saw that he was subservient to someone greater, they would fear the Emperor more than anyone. But of course, eventually that was indeed achieved, and this left Sidious without any other goal. I think this is when he starts to test, and to simply mess with Vader. He introduces other darkside acolytes such as his hands as Mara Jade, to make his apprentice and Vader feel threatened. He would also send him on the deadliest of missions. He would organize assassination attempts, or put him in positions beneath Grand Moff Tarkin, which Vader hated. All of this to keep Palpatine entertained. He claims it's to teach his apprentice a lesson, or to test loyalty. But in reality, if we line up all of the things that Palpatine does, it becomes very clear that he's doing these things to Vader simply because he's bored. It's as if he needs someone to scheme against in order to feel fulfilled in any way. But the only being powerful enough to make it interesting is Vader. Not to mention, with every challenge that Vader overcomes, the more powerful he gets. And not just that, but each challenge continues to break Vader's hope of overcoming his master even more. He constantly learns that Palpatine is in control of everything, It makes him appear nigh omniscient. All in all though, each scheme makes Vader stronger, but more subservient to Palpatine, so it's a win-win for the Dark Lord. But he soon comes to realize that this abusive chess game with his apprentice runs the risk of Vader finding ways to overthrow him, such as when Vader trained Galen Marek and then attempted to train Luke Skywalker. But perhaps for Sidious, it would have all been worth it in the end. All he had to do was stay 2 steps ahead and ensure that Vader never found a foothold. But as for the rest of his empire, things wouldn't become interesting for him until the rebellion took out the freshly completed Death Star. This definitely was not the entertainment he was looking for, as it enraged him beyond reason, but it was at least something to do with all of his power. When Luke Skywalker first laid his eyes on Darth Sidious, he almost couldn't believe what he was seeing. Here was a man who had turned his father to the dark side, destroyed the entire Jedi Order, rewrote galactic history itself to establish a tyrannical regime, and was touted as the most powerful wielder in the Force to potentially ever exist. And when Luke saw him, he was a tired, shriveled old man in a chair. This had not been the man that he had expected, but very soon he would feel the true power of the Emperor. And when he tasted Sidious's lightning, he finally understood. And had it not been for his father, it may have been the very last thing that he ever understood. We believe that many make Luke's mistake by judging Palpatine's outward appearance in Return of the Jedi, and believe that Palpatine has declined since his days in Revenge of the Sith at his peak. But simply because he doesn't show his skill with the lightsaber doesn't mean that he's any weaker than he was before. In fact, the Emperor has become vastly more powerful since Revenge of the Sith. But just how much more powerful is the question that we seek the answer to today. So let's attempt to place a measuring tape between Palpatine's strength in Revenge of the Sith and connect it to the lore in Return of the Jedi, and in between Episode 6. Welcome to the Archives, Acolytes. Now, let us begin. Palpatine's power creep is something that mostly happens in the background. He began his life as an exceptionally strong Force wielder, having a natural affinity towards the ability to conceal himself in the Force. Upon his first meeting with Darth Plagueis, he was astounded to find that he could not probe into the boy's mind like a normal being, or detect his strength in the Force whatsoever like he could the Jedi. It was Palpatine's natural stealth that kept him from ever being discovered as an infant by the Jedi Order originally. Palpatine would of course go on to hone this ability, and in my opinion, be the greatest to ever use this technique of all time in all of the lore, as he was able to stand in the very same room as Grandmaster Yoda and the rest of the Jedi High Council without ever worrying about being detected. In his youth, Palpatine was strong enough in the Force to unleash his raw power in destructive ways. He even managed to slaughter his entire family when he unchained the beast that was latent within him. When his weak father pushed him too far, Palpatine snapped, and Sidious was truly born, the man that he always was beneath the mask. But it would be Darth Plagueis that would go on to show him his raw potential was significant. It was nothing in the face, however, of real knowledge in the dark side. Real power. That is the kind of power that only a Dark Lord of the Sith can understand and wield. And finally, in 32 BBY following the Naboo crisis, Palpatine and Plagueis' machinations had paid off, and the Sith Senator from Naboo had been elected as the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic. The night before Palpatine's acceptance speech of the position, however, he got Plagueis drunk, and the Sith Master passed out on his couch in his penthouse. It was at this very moment that the dark side itself reached out and hissed in Palpatine's ear, finally indicating that it was time. Sidious would violently wake his master by electrocuting him with Force lightning, damaging Plagueis' breathing mask very strategically, hampering his ability to fight back. He then proceeded to choke the life out of the man, while pontificating about all of his grievances against Plagueis as a master, and the joy of his victory. Finally, in the end, Plagueis was dead, and now Sidious walked out to the balcony of his penthouse suite. This is what the Plagueis novel reads. A tremor took hold of the planet, sprung from death. It unleashed itself in a powerful wave, at once burrowing deep into the world's core and radiating through its saccharine atmosphere to shake the stars themselves. At the quake's epicenter stood Sidious, one elegant hand vised at the burnished sill of an expansive translucency, a vessel filled suddenly to bursting, the Force so strong within him that he feared he may disappear into it, never to return again. But the moment didn't constitute an ending so much as a true beginning. A beginning long overdue. It was less a transformation than an intensification, a gravatic shift. A welter of voices near and far, present and from eons past, drowned his thoughts. Raised in praise, the voices proclaimed his reign and cheered the inauguration of a new order. Yellow eyes lifted to the night sky. He saw the trembling stars flare, and in the depth of his being, he felt the power of the dark side anoint him. This was the first big breakthrough of Palpatine's power, and we get to read what it feels like firsthand. The reason we bring this up is because it's apparent that by the time of the Clone Wars, that the rule of two has truly changed. It has become ritualized. 1,000 years of Sith killing their master to take the mantle had infused that very act with dark power. In a way, the passage seems to suggest that Sidious was inheriting the power of his predecessors, but whether or not that theory is true, it's clear that his power intensified exponentially after Plagueis' death. He was already quite powerful by this point, but this boost placed him well over the power of Dooku, and he was strong enough to take Dooku on as an apprentice just following. Assuming this brings us to Palpatine's baseline power, after about 10 more years of experience, Sidious lands on the same standing ground as Grandmaster Yoda by Revenge of the Sith. In just about every source that we can find, it is repeatedly stated that Sidious and Yoda are equal in terms of power. This revelation is truly astounding to us when we consider the depths of Yoda's training. We loosely calculate that he's well over 800 years of experience by this point, and this shows itself with Yoda's incredible command of the Force. He was able to absorb Dooku's lightning like it was basically nothing, and during the Battle of Coruscant, he telekinetically manipulates 2 giant separatist dropships to crash into one another, then goes and does it twice more. But then a few days later, when he's battling Sidious in the Senate, he meets his match. The first time he's hit with Sidious's lightning, the sheer strength and the speed of it completely takes him by surprise. He couldn't even sense the force within Palpatine fast enough to react. Palpatine raised his hand slowly, but summoned the dark side at the very last moment. This threw Yoda off. It was said that Sidious was so proficient in Force Lightning that he could summon it faster than he could telekinesis, so it was often quicker for him to use it rather than manipulate objects than picking them up with his mind. Force Lightning is already considered an extremely advanced dark side technique since it manifests as pure hatred, but transforms it on a physical energy level. And Sidious did it so fast that not even Yoda could feel his hatred in time. During their battle with the Senate pods, the lightning was enough to blast Yoda's saber out of his hand, and after that, there was a brief moment where the Jedi Master's Terminus was nearly overwhelmed by Sidious's power. According to the novel for Revenge of the Sith, even Mace Windu's Vapad, an ability literally meant to counter the dark side, nearly broke over Palpatine's resolve and might. If it weren't for the fact that his own lightning was about to kill him faster, Sidious may have completely shattered Windu's signature skill. And we need not mention how he made absolute mockeries of Maul and Savage, or the very best duelists on the Jedi Council. Revenge of the Sith Palpatine is easily one of the strongest Force users to have ever lived. But what we've been leading to is that none of that compares to how strong he was in the next 20 years. The Jedi archives contain Sith artifacts and holocrons that the Jedi were unable to destroy. Knowledge deemed so dangerous that it had to be kept among them. With access to all of this, along with troves of knowledge pointing to other Sith locations, Sidious was able to spend his spare time pursuing even more knowledge in the dark side, which is what Plagueis had always taught him had true power. It wasn't just a matter of growing stronger with time. Palpatine was throwing himself deeply into the study of all things that was denied him under Plagueis. No longer was he forced to hide his ambitions from a master or from the public and the Republic itself. He did not have to hide who he was, and he could collect whatever ancient lore he needed, using the endless resources of the Empire. He even went to Korriban to learn straight from the spirits of the dead, though this didn't exactly go well for him. Without anything impeding his study besides a busy schedule as the Emperor, Sidious grew above and beyond what was previously ever thought possible. If he was Yoda's equal on Coruscant, he was vastly superior by the time of the Galactic Civil War, and in canon, he used the power of the Sith Shrine beneath the Jedi Temple to tear knowledge right out of the Force itself. Even though the Force tried to resist him, he managed to peer into it, and this is how he learned that Luke was Vader's son. Furthermore, we know that he also managed to open a small window into the world between worlds. He did this in Rebels, unleashing a dark-side alchemical flame attempting to stop Ahsoka Tano and Ezra Bridger. This kind of esoteric knowledge speaks to the extent of his arcane abilities at this point. He had become a Sith sorcerer on par with the Ancients, denying himself nothing, grabbing every bit of information the Force attempted to keep from him. He would even track down and discover the secret to essence transfer, a power completely thought lost. In Legends, he would demonstrate his incredible power against Galen Merrick, proving just how refined his lightning had become, and he was now able to mold it into shapes, surrounding himself with shields in order to protect against all kinds of damage. This was an application of the ability not thought possible. He likely knew kinetite, and could cause objects to explode on impact. One of the best accounts of his power comes from Luke, who would have lasting health issues after being on the end of Sidious's lightning. Sidious could fly with telekinesis. He did this while simultaneously concentrating on keeping his lightning shield active. We know, of course, these are all video game feats, but they still stand somewhat. According to Dark Empire though, before his defeat he was said to have become so powerful that Sidious had become a dark side nexus itself, and was threatening to tear through space and time utilizing the Force Storm technique, a technique that he nearly mastered. It would have made him the only one. Typically in the lore, Sith of sufficient strength can create Force nexuses through experimentation or dark side rituals, but Darth Sidious literally became one himself, just like Darth Nihilus. The reason he looked so weak in Return of the Jedi was due to his mortal flesh. The dark side ravages the body, it saps it of all life and energy. Palpatine was using heavy dark rituals to keep himself vitalized until he could transfer his essence into a brand new host body. But his power in the Force was so great that it was literally breaking down his very body. So while he was physically frail and required the use of a cane, he remained a nexus of dark power. So all in all, the power gap between Revenge of the Sith Palpatine and Return of the Jedi Emperor Palpatine is actually a considerable one. Even if Yoda wanted to come out of retirement from Dagobah and aid Luke, he had officially become outclassed by the Dark Lord. And unlike most power systems, the Force often cannot be quantified in numbers or percentages. The Rule of Two was the most radical transformation in Sith philosophy since the Order's very creation. Conceived by Darth Bane after he witnessed the self-destruction of the Brotherhood of Darkness, the Rule of Two declared that there could only ever be two Sith at any given time, a master who embodied the power of the dark side, and an apprentice who craved it. The cycle of succession through betrayal was designed to ensure that the Sith would grow stronger with each passing generation, distilling their knowledge and hatred rather than diluting it among countless rivals. By concentrating their secrets and ambitions into a single line of power, Bane believed that the Sith could avoid the chaos and arrogance that had doomed them in the past centuries. For 1,000 years, the Rule of Two forced the Sith into the shadows. They became patient conspirators instead of marauding warlords, operating as hidden architects of corruption rather than overt conquerors. Their secrecy was not a weakness, it was their greatest weapon. While the Jedi believed the Sith were extinct, the Rule of Two allowed each Dark Lord to train an apprentice in absolute secrecy, creating a lineage of increasingly cunning and powerful Sith. Over generations, this doctrine produced masters who were experts in deception, infiltration, and political manipulation, ultimately preparing the Sith to strike when the Republic was at its most complacent. It was precisely this hidden approach that allowed Darth Sidious to ascend. The Rule of Two taught him patience and the value of working from within rather than attacking openly. As a senator, then chancellor, and finally emperor, Palpatine exploited every weakness in the Republic while concealing his true nature. The discipline of the Rule of Two gave him a means to an end to corrupt Anakin, to engineer the fall of the Jedi, and to transform the Republic into the Galactic Empire. Though Palpatine would eventually come to see this rule as a temporary tool rather than a sacred tradition, it was this system that enabled him to fulfill the Sith's millennia-old dream of galactic domination. Sidious had been the culmination of it all. But this raises a question at the heart of the Sith philosophy. If Anakin Skywalker had truly had the potential to surpass every Sith Lord before him, even to destroy Palpatine himself, why would Sidious invest so much training in him? Why deliberately nurture a rival whose power could eventually eclipse his own? In today's Holocron, my friends, we're not only going to be answering this question, we will also be breaking down why Palpatine never fully trusted the Rule of Two, and how eventually he decided to completely discard it, and why. But before we open the Holocrons and listen closely, we have received a terrible vision. Many who are visiting the archives are not yet a part of our order, so if that's you, reach out with the Force and crush that subscribe button. It is your destiny. The answer lies in the paradox that Darth Bane's Rule of Two was designed to embrace. According to this doctrine, the Sith should only grow stronger if each generation surpassed the last. For the line to evolve, the Master had to accept the possibility of being overthrown. This was not just a risk, it was the intended outcome. The apprentice's ambition, tempered by the Master's cunning, created a cycle of conflict that distills the Sith's power into its purest form. Sidious understood this principle better than anyone, and for much of his life, he would adhere to it, at least publicly. And yet, Palpatine's vision diverged from Bane's in a fundamental way. Sidious believed he could manipulate the cycle without ever falling victim to it. In his mind, Anakin's potential was both a threat and a necessity, a weapon too powerful to ignore. By molding Anakin from a young age, corrupting his attachments, and isolating him from the Jedi, Sidious believed he could channel the power without ever truly relinquishing control. And even if the day came when Anakin's strength could challenge his own, Palpatine planned to transcend death itself, to cheat succession and render the rule of two obsolete. In training Anakin, he was not only ensuring the destruction of the Jedi, but also proving to himself that he could master the system that had defined the Sith for 1,000 years. Palpatine thought of the Force itself, and the unnatural circumstances of Anakin's birth as presenting him with a rival, but a rival worthy of his ambition. The legend of the Chosen One, the prophecy of balance, and Anakin's unprecedented potential were in Sidious's eyes perhaps the Force's final countermove against the Sith's rise. Where lesser Sith Lords may have seen this as a threat to be eliminated outright, Palpatine saw it as a challenge to be mastered. This is where he differed from Darth Plagueis, who wanted the boy dead. But Palpatine saw a greater opportunity, a test of whether his own cunning, his knowledge of the dark side, and mastery of manipulation were truly limitless. In this sense, Anakin was not simply another apprentice. He was an existential obstacle, a living embodiment of destiny that seemed to promise the end of the Sith. But rather than shrink from that possibility, Palpatine embraced it with a kind of cold fascination. He believed that if he could bend Anakin's destiny to his will, if he could corrupt the Chosen One so thoroughly that the very prophecy would become an instrument of darkness, then it would prove beyond a doubt that his power eclipsed every Jedi and every Sith that had ever lived. Palpatine saw Anakin as the culmination of every prophecy, every experiment in alchemy, every ancient legend about beings born to reshape the galaxy, and whether he suspected the Force has created Anakin directly as a counterbalance, or whether he himself had unknowingly triggered the birth through Plagueis' experiments, Sidious recognized that Skywalker was no mere servant. He was a phenomenon, a singular event in the Force that could either destroy or immortalize the Sith. Yet for all of that, Palpatine was never intimidated by Anakin's potential. He believed his superior knowledge of the Sith lore, his mastery of deception, and his patient cultivation of Anakin's emotional weaknesses, that being fear, anger, and attachment, would keep the Chosen One in perpetual chains. Even as he praised Anakin's strength and flattered his ego, Sidious laid the groundwork to ensure that power was never truly turned against him. He exploited Anakin's love for Padme as both a lure and a poison. He isolated him from the Council, feeding his suspicion and pride, and he orchestrated the Clone Wars themselves as a crucible of violence and desperation, a perfect environment to breed a Sith Lord who would be grateful, broken, and utterly dependent. By the time Anakin knelt before him as Darth Vader, the idea that he could rise to challenge Palpatine must have seemed laughably remote. Even if he had escaped Mustafar unscarred, Sidious would have relied on more than simple loyalty to maintain control. He possessed the resources of a galaxy, an army, an imperial network of intelligences, the Inquisitors, hidden dark-side cults that proliferated under his reign. More than that, he had decades of hidden knowledge. He had access to ancient Sith techniques, alchemical rites, and forbidden rituals designed to break minds and to hollow out souls. In his view, these assets would be more than sufficient to subjugate even a being as powerful as Anakin. To Palpatine, Anakin represented not only the Force's ultimate challenge, but also final proof of his supremacy. If he could twist the Chosen One to his will, he would have conquered not just the Jedi or the Republic, but now destiny itself. That was the ultimate ambition, to stand above prophecy, to stand above tradition, all cycles of death and rebirth, to make himself the one true constant in a galaxy forever in flux. In this way, Palpatine's willingness to train Anakin was not done out of naivety, but it was the purest expression of his arrogance, the unshakable belief that no rival, no matter how powerful or preordained, could ever escape the gravity of his control. It is the most striking irony in Sith history that while Palpatine believed he alone had outgrown the rule of two, he ultimately fell into the very same trap that destroyed so many of his predecessors. Palpatine convinced himself the succession was a relic of weaker eras, something only lesser Sith needed to fear. He told himself that his mastery of the dark side, his knowledge of ancient secrets, his control over an empire made him immune to all betrayal. In that belief, he was not so different from his own master Plagueis. Plagueis had also been certain that he was the exception, that through his experiments in manipulating the midichlorians and conquering death, that he had risen above the vulnerabilities that plagued the Sith. He believed he was on the verge of achieving a form of immortality that would make apprentices completely unnecessary. Plagueis didn't even intend on originally training Palpatine. He simply viewed his appearance as a gift from the dark side itself, the same way that Palpatine would later view Anakin. Yet in the end, Plagueis died in his sleep, murdered by his own student. Palpatine's arrogance was merely an echo of this cycle. Like Bane before, like Plagueis before, he believed he had broken the pattern. But the Rule of Two was not just a system of succession, it was a reflection of a deeper truth. The dark side thrives on conflict. The more power a Sith gathers, the more certain it becomes that their apprentice will one day rise against them. Palpatine thought he could transcend that inevitability, and in the end, he only proved how inescapable it really was. Vader's own relationship with the Rule of Two was equally complex to his master. When he first embraced the dark side, he did so out of desperation to save his wife, to end the Clone Wars, to impose order on a galaxy plunged into chaos. He did not yet fully grasp that it was a Sith tradition. The apprentice's destiny was to one day overthrow their new master. But for years, Vader was consumed by self-loathing and regret. He served Palpatine less as a partner than as an instrument, a weapon wielded by a master who never let him forget his failures. But as the years wore on, the dynamic would shift. Though Vader's body had been broken, his spirit would gradually harden. He began to see that Palpatine did not truly respect him as any form of a successor. He was not being groomed to inherit a Sith legacy, but to serve as an enforcer until a better candidate could be found. This realization became clearest when Palpatine encouraged rival apprentices and darkside agents to grow in power behind the back of Darth Vader. Palpatine would even encourage them to disrespect him. Individuals like Mara Jade would prove to be a real potential threat, so Vader would need his own plan. The most striking example was Starkiller, a secret apprentice trained by Vader. Starkiller was not just a contingency plan to assassinate the Emperor, he was a mirror held up to Darth Vader himself, a reminder that to Sidious, no apprentice was indispensable. When Palpatine discovered Starkiller's existence, he did not destroy him. Instead, he attempted to twist the situation to his own agenda, using Starkiller as bait to draw out hidden Jedi and to test Vader's loyalty. This cycle of manipulation and betrayal forced Vader to confront the truth of the Rule of Two. Vader began to recognize that the dark side demanded constant conflict, that an apprentice who never challenged the master was little more than a slave. By the end of his life, Vader no longer wished simply to serve. He contemplated overthrowing Palpatine not only to fulfill the ancient Sith tradition, but to finally claim the agency that he had been denied since Mustafar. In this way, Vader's story closed the circle that Bane set in motion. Even a master as cunning as Darth Sidious, who believed himself the culmination of all Sith ambition, could not escape the fundamental law that power invites rebellion. The Rule of Two was not a set of rules to be outgrown. It was a reflection of the dark side's truest nature, that in the end, there can only be one. But there is yet another dimension to Palpatine's intentions for Anakin, one rarely discussed in the histories of Sith. For all his proclamations of apprenticeship and destiny, Sidious almost certainly never intended to allow Anakin to rule the Empire as any equal. Instead, he saw Anakin as the culmination of centuries of selective breeding, alchemical experiments, and prophecy, a living vessel designed by the Force. And he knew this from the beginning. Palpatine viewed that vessel as a contingency for his own immortality. The technique of essence transfer, the ability to project one's consciousness into another body, was a secret long lost, even to masters like Darth Plagueis. Plagueis had dedicated his life to manipulating the midichlorians, to creating life and prolonging it unnaturally. But he never truly rediscovered the ritual that would allow his spirit to cheat death indefinitely. Sidious, however, was not bound by his master's limitations. Through years of clandestine research, he eventually uncovered this forbidden knowledge preserved in the holocron of Darth Andedu, an ancient Dark Lord who had sealed his consciousness into a hidden vault. And while Dooku served as Sidious's political instrument, he also provided crucial access to Sith archives, artifacts, and obscure histories through his own research and adventures. And after the fall of the Jedi and the Republic, it would be from these sources that Palpatine reconstructed the ritual of essence transfer, surpassing even the achievements of Darth Plagueis. This was the secret that made Sidious confident he would outlast any rival. He no longer needed to fear the decay of his own flesh, or the succession demanded by the Rule of Two. And in the figure of Anakin Skywalker, unburned, unbroken, and unimaginably strong in the Force, he saw not just a servant, but the perfect vessel. a body that could house his spirit unchallenged for centuries. Though he never spoke of these intentions aloud, his actions revealed the truth. Palpatine invested more in Anakin than anyone else. He destroyed the Jedi and the Republic to clear a path for the Chosen One's ascendance. He engineered Anakin's isolation and orchestrated his fall with the precision of a master alchemist, refining a singular, priceless material. And in the final hours of the Clone Wars, he did everything in his power to ensure Anakin would arrive at his side whole, ready, beginning to shape the galaxy. It is the greatest irony of all that his plan was undone not by prophecy or betrayal, but by the molten fires of Mustafar. When Anakin emerged from that crucible shattered, Palpatine's ambitions were forced to adapt. The perfect vessel was gone, replaced by a broken shell whose potential had been forever diminished. And so while Sidious continued to rule and scheme, he never again possessed the single ideal candidate to host his consciousness. Yet, this ambition to take the body of his greatest creation and inhabit it for all of time reveals the depth of his heresy. Where the rule of two demanded succession, Palpatine sought permanence. Where Bane taught that the apprentice must one day overthrow the master, Sidious planned to erase that possibility altogether. And in doing so, he demonstrated that for all his cunning, he had become precisely what Bane despised, a Sith Lord so intoxicated by his own power that he believed himself beyond the reach of history itself. Yet, while Bane's rule of two achieved what no Sith Empire ever could, survival and triumph over the Jedi, it ultimately contained the seeds of its own destruction. The system was never designed to create a Sith dynasty that would endure forever. It was meant to refine Sith power through conflict and succession, to ensure that the Order remained strong precisely because it never stopped evolving. Palpatine's greatest error was believing he could freeze that evolution. His conviction that he had outgrown the rule of two was not an expression of strength, but of hubris. In seeking to rule eternally, he rejected the very principle that had allowed the Sith to survive 1,000 years. He believed himself immune to betrayal, immune to consequence, immune to the Force itself. But the dark side always demands a price, and so the cycle that he tried to transcend finally claimed him. In this arrogance, he underestimated Anakin's capacity for redemption and Luke's refusal to surrender to hate. And when he was cast down the reactor core of the Death Star, it was not simply the defeat of a tyrant, it was the total collapse of a philosophy that had decayed into self-worship. Even that, though, was not the end. In the years that followed, Palpatine's clone body returned, defiant and unrepentant. He declared himself immortal, the living embodiment of the dark side, the unending will of the Sith. But in that end, even this resurrection was a hollow one. It was Luke Skywalker, the son of the apprentice Sidious believed he had forever broken, who would finally destroy him. The truth could not be avoided. No ritual, no clone, no hidden contingency could shield Palpatine from the same flaw that had destroyed all of the Sith before him. His arrogance was too vast to contain. His faith in his own invincibility was the most profound weakness of them all. In the final reckoning, Sidious was not the culmination of the Sith's triumph, but proof of their ultimate failure. He had proclaimed himself beyond the rule of two, the end of the old tradition and the first of a new. And in that sense, he was right. He was the last true Dark Lord of the Banite lineage. He was the dark side's greatest champion, the ultimate expression of the Sith's ambition and their folly. But in believing himself above the cycle of master and apprentice, in imagining that he alone could stand unchallenged forever, Palpatine became exactly what the rule of two had been created to prevent. A master so consumed by his own power that he could no longer see the blade poised at his back. And so in the end, it was not the Jedi or the Republic or the will of the Force that undid him. It was the same thing that had always destroyed the Sith: hubris. The fall of Emperor Palpatine marked the end of an era. His death was at the hands of his own apprentice. This was a spectacle that shook the galaxy. Yet what followed was perhaps even more shocking. A generation of Sith who viewed his reign not as a triumph, but as a cautionary tale. For all of his power, for all of his mastery of the dark side, and dominion over the galaxy, the Sith who came after Palpatine saw his legacy as a lesson of what not to become. Darth Krayt, Darth Sidious, Lumaya, Darth Red. Figures of great power in their own right, they all rarely disputed Palpatine's raw strength and profound connection to the dark side. Many of them may have even admitted that he surpassed them in sheer mastery of the Force. And yet, they did not revere him as the ultimate Sith. His defeat in their eyes was not due to weakness of power, but a weakness in philosophy. a failure to secure the long-term survival of the Sith Order, a desire for control, not over the dark side, but over its practitioners, at the cost of the Sith Order's strength. To the Sith who followed in the lineage, Palpatine was a paradox, a Titan who conquered the galaxy, yet left it vulnerable to collapse the moment that his throne fell. His arrogance, his need to hoard power rather than share it, and his failure to properly prepare for successors all became points of contempt for those that would rise from his ashes. They saw him not as a true Dark Lord to be admired, but as a relic, a Sith so consumed by his own dominance that he doomed the Empire to fall with it. Today we will explore the complex and often brutal opinions the Sith who followed Palpatine held about his reign, how they respected his power, but scorned his vision, how his greatest missteps were not in his strength, but in his failure to ensure the survival of the Sith legacy. This is the untold story of how the galaxy's most feared Dark Lord became a symbol both of ultimate power and ultimate failure. Among the Sith who followed Palpatine, few had a more personal connection to his reign than Lumaya did. Once an Imperial agent and apprentice to Lord Vader, she served directly under the Emperor's rule during the height of his galactic empire. She trained both in the ways of manipulation and combat. She was molded to be a perfect weapon for the Sith cause. Yet, despite her close ties to Palpatine's empire, even Lumaya grew disillusioned with the very philosophy that she had once upheld. To Lumaya, Palpatine's power was undeniable. He had brought the galaxy to its knees, crushed the Jedi, and established a reign of fear and control on a galactic scale. But it was in that control where she saw his greatest failure as well. His focus on absolute dominion, on the rule of one where all of the power was concentrated into a single being. This in turn left the Sith vulnerable. Palpatine had not built a legacy. He had built an empire designed to collapse in his absence. The destruction of the second Death Star, the death of both he and Vader left a power vacuum so severe that the Sith nearly vanished entirely, as if their order had been nothing more than a reflection of Palpatine's own ego. Lumaya believed that Palpatine's mistake was not a failure of strength, but a failure of vision. He sought to end the cycle of the Sith's betrayal, hoarding knowledge rather than passing it down. He dismissed the value of a strong, evolving order in favor of personal immortality and dominance. To Lumaya, the Sith Code demanded adaptation, not stagnation. And yet, for all of her criticisms of Palpatine, Lumaya could not fully break from his influence. She attempted to continue his dark legacy, training Jacen Solo as Kaitis in an effort to recreate what Palpatine accomplished, but this time with a new generation, a Sith Order more focused on lasting control rather than personal glory. Lumaya's view of Palpatine was the most complex of all. It was admiration mixed with resentment. She recognized his greatness, but viewed his philosophy as ultimately flawed. A tale of how even the most powerful could doom their own empire when blinded by their own self-interest. And in her quest to rebuild the Sith, Lumaya reflected the very paradox that she criticized, failing to break free from the shadows of the past while striving to redefine the future. But now, let us speak of Darth Kaitis. Jacen Solo once carried perhaps the most complicated relationship with Palpatine's legacy among all of the Sith that followed. Born into the Skywalker bloodline, one that Palpatine himself manipulated and corrupted for generations, Jacen Solo grew up with a profound understanding of the evil that his family had faced. To him, Palpatine was not just a tyrant of history, but the architect of the very fall of his grandfather Anakin, and the near annihilation of the Jedi Order. More than any other Sith who came before, Darth Kaitis believed in Palpatine's pure evil. To him, Palpatine was more than a legend. He was a great power that still influenced and haunted the galaxy around him. Jacen hated him. Yet, when Jacen fell to the dark side and embraced a new identity as Darth Kaitis, his perspective on Palpatine shifted. While he never excused Palpatine's cruelty or his obsession with ultimate power, Kaitis came to believe that Palpatine's greatest failure was not in his darkness, but in his selfishness. Kaitis saw himself as something greater, a Sith Lord who embraced power not for personal glory, but for a necessary evil. To Kaitis, the galaxy required strength, control, and sacrifice to prevent chaos. He believed that unlike Palpatine, he could wield the dark side with purpose, protect the galaxy, never dominate it. This belief, however, mirrored Palpatine's own justifications more closely than Kaitis would have ever admitted. Palpatine himself believed that peace could be forged through fear and control. The difference, though, was in their intentions. While Palpatine ruled for his own eternal power, Darth Sidious saw himself as a tragic figure, a savior forced to become the monster to secure the Order. Yet both fell victim to the same Sith flaw, the illusion that absolute control could bring lasting peace. Sidious's view on Palpatine then was defined by both revulsion and reluctant respect. He detested the Sith Lord for his corruption of the Skywalker bloodline, viewing him as their eternal enemy, but he could not ignore the truth of his power. Sidious believed that Palpatine's cruelty, while excessive, had proven the effectiveness of his strength, and he justified his own descent into darkness as he convinced himself that he was avoiding all of the mistakes that Palpatine made, while in truth, tragically repeating them in a different form. And now we move on to my favorite. Of all of the Sith who followed in Palpatine's shadow, none despised him more than Darth Krayt. And for very good reason. Once a Jedi Asherad Het and a survivor of Order 66, Krayt suffered under Palpatine's tyranny in the way that no other Sith Lord would. He wasn't merely haunted by his legacy, he had lived through it, watched it devastate everything he had sworn to protect and love. His hatred for Palpatine was personal. It was not born by abstract philosophy or distant galactic wars, but from the scars that Palpatine had left on his soul. Het's fall to the dark side was not driven by ambition or power, it was a turn of desperation. As a broken Jedi hunted following the Purge, he turned to the Sith not for personal gain, but to learn how to kill. To kill Palpatine, to kill Vader. In his soul, he knew that to destroy the Sith, to bring back balance to the Force in his mind, he needed to become one. He studied the darkest secrets of the Force not to conquer, but to destroy the monster who had shattered the galaxy. Yet as the years went on, and the Empire fell, Het's hatred outlived his target. Palpatine was dead, yet the scars remained, and so did the power that Het uncovered in his quest for vengeance. When Het fully embraced his new identity as Darth Krayt, naming himself after the Krayt dragons of his homeworld of Tatooine, his philosophy shifted as well, but his hatred would never change. He came to reject not just Palpatine the man, but the model of the Sith rule that Palpatine embodied. Krayt saw Palpatine as an ultimate failure, not because of his strength, but because of his obsession with personal control. Krayt believed that the rule of two was the isolation of knowledge, the desire for absolute mastery without sharing it. Krayt saw all of this as a path to self-destruction. Palpatine had created an empire that was powerful only while he lived, with no true successor, no lasting order, and in Krayt's eyes, this was a betrayal of what the Sith should be. Krayt's one Sith rejected Palpatine's vision entirely. Where Palpatine hoarded power, Krayt sought to unify it. Where Palpatine ruled by fear, Krayt attempted to rule by control through loyalty. He built a collective Sith bound by vision, not constant betrayal and infighting. But make no mistake, Darth Krayt did not reject the dark side. His hatred for Palpatine fueled his rise in turn, shaping him into a Sith far more ideological, yet just as ruthless. And though Krayt had surpassed the Emperor in his own mind, the core resentment of Palpatine never faded. For Darth Krayt, Palpatine had not just been a tyrant, he was the architect of his suffering, a reminder of what the Sith should never become. The final Sith in the long fractured legacy that we'll be discussing today is the last of Palpatine's shadow, the most tragic of them all, a Sith by the name of Darth Red. Darth Red was a figure born not from ambition or obsession with power, but one through pain and betrayal, a desire for something greater. His hatred for the Sith burned deeper than any other, for he had not only been their victim, but had become what he despised the most, a tool of their corruption, trapped in their cycle that he swore to destroy. Darth Red's story began not as a Sith Lord, but as a victim of the Sith's brutality. His family was mercilessly slaughtered by the one Sith in their campaign for control under Darth Krayt's regime. The man that would become Red was broken, consumed by grief, but he was taken and twisted by the very monsters who destroyed his life. The Sith Order corrupted him, not with promises of power, but with the raw reality of suffering, forcing the man to become the weapon in the name of a dark ideology. Yet even as he embraced the dark side, the hatred he felt for his captors would never leave him. Red despised everything the Sith represented: obsession, control, the relentless cycle of violence perpetuated by Palpatine. To Darth Red, Palpatine was not just the architect of a Sith empire, but the embodiment of everything wrong with the dark side. A man who saw absolute power not to liberate, but to enslave. Palpatine's philosophy of dominance over the galaxy, his use of fear, and his need to be the sole master all symbolized the corruption that Darth Red believed had poisoned the galaxy. And yet, for all of his hatred, Darth Red embraced the dark side, not because he desired power, but because he believed it was the only way to destroy the Sith from within, just like Darth Krayt. Red became one of them, played their game, but with a singular purpose: to end their rule. He hunted the surviving members of the One Sith after Krayt's death, seeing them as echoes of Palpatine's failed ideology, and turned their own darkness against them. He became a Sith hunter of Sith. This was his rebellion, a purge fueled by the very anger that the Sith instilled in his soul. And yet, in becoming a Sith Lord himself, Darth Red fell into the same cycle of violence and vengeance that he sought to so desperately break. Darth Red's tragic arc was the most damning reflection of Palpatine's legacy. He was a man that was shaped by the horrors of tyranny, twisted into the image of darkness that he despised. Palpatine's failure was not just in his own downfall, but in the endless echoes of pain that he would leave behind. Wounds so deep that they could turn a man like Darth Red into an executioner and a victim. And so as the last Sith fell, it was not with triumph, but with sorrow, the final proof that Palpatine's dark influence had scarred the galaxy long after his death. The Sith has always remained endlessly critical of one another, even themselves. For all of their power, for all of their mastery of the dark side, they are trapped in a cycle of destruction, forever seeking flaws in those who came before, while falling to the same obsessions. Palpatine was no exception, and neither were those that followed him. Krayt, Lumaya, Kaitis, Red, they all scorned his rule in different ways. His selfishness, his hoarding of power, his failure to build a lasting legacy beyond himself. Yet in their own pursuit of strength, they too repeated these mistakes. They clung to their own vision of control, their own ideas of how the Sith should endure. And in doing that, they reflected the very darkness they sought to overcome. But for all their hatred and criticism, the truth is undeniable. Palpatine left his mark on the Sith Order and the galactic legacy. His reign was the ultimate expression of the Sith dominance, an empire forged through fear, cunning, and mastery of the dark side. The Sith who would follow could not escape Palpatine's shadow, no matter how loudly they rejected his teachings. His legacy lingered, not just in the power that he wielded, but in the consequences of his failures. Every generation of Sith after him was either shaped by his philosophy or defined by their opposition to it. In this way, Palpatine's influence endured far longer than his reign would. But the cruelest truth of them all, Palpatine never would have even cared. The opinions of those who came after him, whether admiration or hatred, were all beneath him. To him, the Sith were tools, stepping stones for his ultimate ambition of eternal control. He never sought to create a lasting Sith Order, or ensure the survival of any of his teachings. Palpatine's only true loyalty was always to himself. And so, the Sith who followed, so desperate to define themselves by their defiance of him, were merely echoes of a man who had already discarded them long before his final fall. The Force Storm is among the most apocalyptic abilities ever attributed to the Force, a phenomenon of legend and terror spoken in hushed tones by the Jedi and Sith alike. To conjure a Force Storm was to harness the dark side's raw, untamed chaos, and to wield it on a galactic scale. For Emperor Palpatine, the ability became an obsession of him later in life, a manifestation of his ultimate vision of domination, not merely ruling the galaxy, but reshaping it at a whim. The myths of the Force Storm fascinated him for decades on end, leading to him uncovering fragments of its lore and attempting to master the terrifying power for himself. But to begin, what is a Force Storm? And why did it fascinate Palpatine so much? As well as why it was outlawed by the Sith that followed. A Force Storm is considered the epitome of the dark side's power, a devastating manipulation of space-time and hyperspace that manifests itself as a massive vortex of energy. These storms are capable of tearing through hyperspace. They open hyperspace wormholes capable of transporting matter, ships, and even armies instantaneously across vast distances. They destroy entire fleets or worlds, and the energy released by a Force Storm can obliterate everything in a radius, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. It can also bend the Force itself. The Conjurer bends the fabric of reality, channeling unimaginable dark side energy to dominate or destroy. Force storms are not mere accidents of the Force. They are the product of intentional, focused willpower. They represent a convergence of Sith rituals, deep understanding of hyperspace mechanics, and a mastery of the dark side's destructive potentials. To summon a Force storm is to challenge the boundaries of the galaxy. But what are their origins? The myth shrouded with time. The origins of the Force storm lie in the ancient days of the Sith, a time when the dark side practitioners delved deeply into the mysteries of the Force. The earliest Sith Lords, particularly those influenced by the teachings of the Rakata, sought to bend nature to their very will, not just manipulating life, but warping the very fabric of reality. They became obsessed with creation and perversion, crafting monstrous creatures, unleashing storms of energies to devastate their enemy. Force storms were likely discovered by accident during this time, the byproduct of experiments in hyperspace manipulation. Early Sith Lords, such as those from the era of the Sith Empire, may have combined their knowledge of hyperspace travel with the dark side and rituals, inadvertently opening rifts in space-time. Over time though, some Sith redefined this into an intentional technique, but its chaotic and self-destructive nature would mean that few would ever dare use it. By the time of the Great Hyperspace War, the ability had become myth, a whispered legend among Sith sorcerers, but may be experimented on by the Dark Jedi, the original 12 who made their way to Korriban so many years ago. They were the ones that made major advancements in rituals after all, the minds of Sorza Sin, Ajunta Pal, Tulek Horde, and others. But as time went on, it was deemed too dangerous, even for the ancients. It was in the Great Hyperspace War that the ability had become a myth, whispered only in legend among sorcerers. The ancient Sith recognized its potential but feared it greatly, regarding it as a power that could not only destroy their enemies, but themselves, and even entire empires. Even for them, it was too dangerous. Over millennia, the precise knowledge of the Force storms faded, considered too dangerous to preserve, even by the Sith, so they made no attempts to do so. Imagine that, guys. A Force ability so evil, so capable of destruction, that even the Sith didn't record it. This is what Palpatine sought after for so long. His obsession with Force storms. You see, Palpatine no longer collected material things. Palpatine collected knowledge, rituals. As Sidious, he was fascinated by the Force storm and similar abilities. He viewed them as the ultimate expression of the Sith's mastery over the galaxy, mastering an ability that the other Sith feared. Like the ancients who sought to pervert or reshape life, Palpatine craved the ability to reshape the galaxy, a grandiose vision of his image. And the Force storm was the tool in which he would use to wipe away the old. For Sidious, Force storms weren't just weapons, they were tools of creation and beauty. Where the ancient Sith had focused their experiments on creatures or small-scale destruction, Sidious envisioned using the dark side to control hyperspace itself. He wanted to destroy entire fleets and planets with ease. A single wave of his hand would be enough to obliterate armadas, lay waste to rebellious worlds. He would need no fleet, need no military or army. He would be the ultimate force in the galaxy. Galactic control and travel. By mastering hyperspace, Palpatine would isolate or connect any system in the galaxy he pleased, controlling the flow of commerce, travel, and most importantly, war. He could also project his will remotely. Truth be told, Palpatine wanted his dominion to be seen by everybody, but he often locked himself away and found it tedious to present himself to the galaxy, projecting his will now to every single being and take control of the galaxy in a way that no one had seen before. He could cross vast distances instantly, eliminating the need for any physical presence. He could strike from his throne world of Biss or any hidden sanctuary of his choosing, untouchable by any enemy. For decades, Palpatine scoured ancient Sith holocrons and texts, piercing together fragments of the Force storm's lore, anything that he could find. He was enthralled by the idea that with enough mastery, he could become more than a ruler. Palpatine believed that with this lore and information, he could become the galaxy's god. The power of a Force storm was immense, but it is also dangerously unstable. For even the most powerful dark side user, the act of summoning a storm and controlling one presents immense risk. The Force storms draw upon massive amounts of energy, bending space-time and hyperspace. This chaotic energy is incredibly difficult to control and can easily spiral out of the conjurer's grasp at a moment, turning against their wielder and tearing them apart. It also caused immense mental and physical strain. Summoning a Force storm required complete focus and a pure connection to the dark side. Even from someone as powerful as Palpatine, this strain was immense, risking physical and mental collapse if concentration ever faltered. To control the Force storm, it would literally rip your mind apart if you ever lost control of it before it would ever rip your body apart. As the storm destabilizes, it destroys the conjurer and anything around it. Ancient Sith legends tell of sorcerers consumed by their own creations, their power turned inward in a catastrophic implosion, and even Palpatine would struggle to master it. Imagine that, Darth Sidious struggling with a dark side technique. That's how advanced this was. While he succeeded in summoning Force storms during the events of Dark Empire, his inability to fully control them contributed to his downfall. The power was so immense that even Sidious, the most powerful Sith in galactic history, found it too complex to reliably wield. By the time of the Clone Wars, and later on in the Galactic Civil War, Force storms were considered extinct, even among Sith lore. The reason for their disappearance is tied to their inherent dangers and the philosophical shift within the Sith Order as well. The Sith, though devoted to power, understood the dangers of such abilities that destroyed indiscriminately beyond the power of a Dark Lord. Force storms were deemed too unstable, too capable of galactic annihilation. Even Darth Bane, who founded the Rule of Two, rejected the ability, believing it was better to consolidate power through cunning and subterfuge rather than risk total destruction on such a scale. After the events of Dark Empire, Luke Skywalker recognized the catastrophic potential of Force storms, and he resolved to bury the knowledge permanently. He believed no one, Jedi or Sith, should wield such destructive power. For Luke, a Force storm and the ability represented the final frontier of the dark side itself, a boundary that should never be crossed. It was considered the last frontier of the dark side. Force storms remain a mythic symbol of the dark side's ultimate potential, a power so great that it could reshape the galaxy, so dangerous that it can destroy it just as easily. For Palpatine, this was the pinnacle of his ambition, the culmination of his obsession with control and domination, a Force ability that seemed to be made for him, one that he failed to master. Even he could not fully tame it. In many ways, Force storms are the last frontier of the dark side, a reminder of its infinite potential, its boundless chaos. They stand as a testament to the dark side's seductive promise of ultimate power, and the inevitable self-destruction that often follows. But anyway, my friends, what are your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on the Force ability that other Sith Lords were too terrified to touch, but that Palpatine became obsessed by? And as always, my friends, may the Force be with you, and I hope you're having a phenomenal day.